The crack of a Winchester rifle echoes across the painted desert valley. A gleaming brass shell tumbles through the air, catching the harsh Arizona sunlight. In the distance, a tin can explodes off a fence post, dead center at 600 yards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn breaks over a modest homestead nestled against red rock. Formations on the outskirts of Copper Springs. The morning routine of Eleanor Ellie Chambers, a slender woman in her mid-30s, begins with practiced precision. Despite the early hour, her movements are deliberate and efficient as she kindles the stove fire and puts on a pot of coffee. The cabin walls are sparsely decorated, save for a single photograph of a handsome man in Union blue, her late husband, Major Thomas Chambers. Beside it hangs a Medal of Honor in a simple wooden frame, the kind most visitors mistake for an ordinary keepsake rather than the nation's highest military decoration. What these same visitors fail to notice is the worn leather rifle case tucked beneath the bed, a case that hasn't gathered a speck of dust despite 3 years of widowhood. Through the window, beyond her meticulously maintained vegetable garden, stands an inconspicuous clearing behind a cluster of cottonwood trees. Local folks assumed it was where Thomas had taught his wife to fire a simple revolver for protection, a common enough practice in these parts. None had ventured close enough to discover the precisely measured shooting lanes extending to markers at 200, 400, and 600 yards, nor the collection of targets ranging from tin cans to hand-carved wooden silhouettes. Ellie's only companion is a blue-tick hound named Scout, a loyal beast with uncanny awareness. The dog follows her with unwavering devotion, his hunting instincts as sharp as the day Thomas brought him home as a pup. Scout's ears perk up at sounds too distant for human detection, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert in an instant, a sentinel as vigilant as his mistress. In town, Eleanor Chambers is known simply as the Widow at Cottonwood Creek, a quiet woman who sells exquisitely detailed leather goods at the general store for a modest living. Her gloved hands craft intricate holsters, belts, and saddlebags that cowboys and lawmen alike prize for their durability and artistry. They know her as a skilled craftswoman, nothing more and certainly nothing less. The townsfolk of Copper Springs respect her privacy and self-sufficiency. Local ranchers occasionally leave game at her doorstep, though none have ever seen her accept charity directly. What they don't realize is that Eleanor hasn't needed their offerings of venison or rabbit. Her own hunting expeditions during the darkest hours of night have kept her larder well stocked, her shooting skills ensuring clean kills that leave no trace of her marksmanship prowess. Today, like every Friday, Eleanor works meticulously on a custom holster, her slender fingers moving with surprising strength as she tools the leather with decorative patterns. Her reading glasses perched on her nose, she measures twice, cuts once, a philosophy that extends beyond her leatherwork. At Miller's General Store, Ruth Miller serves her the same purchase she's made every Friday for 3 years. Coffee beans, flour, a few essentials, and precisely 7 brass cartridges for a rifle caliber few women would recognize. Ruth is one of the few people who've managed to exchange more than pleasantries with the widow, though even she knows little beyond Eleanor's preference for dark coffee and her punctuality. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Mrs. Chambers?" Ruth offers with a kind smile. "That it is," Eleanor replies softly, her voice gentle from infrequent use. Her eyes, however, scan the store with methodical attention, noting 3 unfamiliar faces by the tobacco counter, rough-looking men whose trail dust hasn't quite settled. Their spurs jingle discordantly against the wooden floor, their gun belts worn in the manner of men accustomed to drawing weapons rather than merely carrying them. The tallest of the men, a weathered figure with a scar running from his left eye, to his jawline nudges his companion as Eleanor gathers her purchases. "Looky there, Mitch. Reckon that fine piece of calico's lonely out on that homestead all by her lonesome?" His voice carries deliberately, meant to reach her ears. Eleanor gives no indication she's heard the remark, continuing her transaction with the same quiet efficiency. Ruth's face flushes with indignation on her behalf, but a subtle shake of Eleanor's head silences any defense the shopkeeper might have offered. As she secures her purchases in a worn saddlebag, Eleanor's gloved hands move with a grace that belies their strength. The leather gloves, a necessity she explained to curious inquirers for her leatherworking, conceal calluses no proper lady should possess, formed by years of pulling triggers and working rifle mechanisms. Back at her homestead, Eleanor receives a rare visitor just after midday. Sheriff William Cooper, a graying man with kind eyes that miss very little, brings news rather than social pleasantries. "Mrs. Chambers," he begins, hat in hand on her porch, declining her offer to step inside. "Thought you should know we've had reports of the Blackwell gang moving through these parts. 3 banks have been hit between here and Tucson in the past month." Eleanor nods her thanks for the warning, her expression revealing nothing of the calculation happening behind her composed features. "I appreciate the concern, Sheriff, but as you can see, I'm quite capable of looking after myself." "Never doubted that for a minute, ma'am," Cooper replies with a respectful nod. "Still, might be prudent to stay in town for a spell, at least, until Marshal Jenkins and his deputies ride through next week." "That's very thoughtful," she answers, "but this is my home. I won't be driven from it by the threat of outlaws." As Cooper rides away, Eleanor's hand unconsciously moves to the hidden pocket of her apron, where a small brass key rests against a folded piece of paper. A letter she's kept close for 3 years, its contents memorized but too painful to destroy. That afternoon, young Billy Thompson, barely 16 and eager to earn extra coins, delivers a repaired bridle to her homestead. The boy's admiration for her leatherwork is evident as she shows him a new technique for hand-stitching. "Ma'am," Billy ventures, eyes wide with excitement as he works beside her, "did you hear about the Blackwell gang? They say Cole Blackwell himself can hit a playing card at 50 paces with his Remington." Eleanor's smile doesn't reach her eyes. "Is that so?" "Yes. My pa says he learned to shoot during the war, just like your husband. Though," the boy adds with the tactlessness of youth, "I guess not quite as good, since the major got that medal and all." As Billy chatters, Eleanor notices him glancing curiously at her right forearm, where her sleeve has ridden up to reveal the edge of a peculiar mark. She quickly adjusts her cuff, but not before the boy catches a glimpse of what appears to be a small tattoo, an eagle's eye inscribed within a perfect circle. "What's that mark, Mrs. Chambers?" Billy asks with unfiltered curiosity. "Just an old memory," Eleanor replies, her tone gentle but final as she rolls down her sleeve completely. "Now, about that saddle your father mentioned needing repairs." The boy recognizes the change of subject for what it is, a boundary not to be crossed, and returns his attention to the leatherwork lesson. By the time he leaves, the question of the mysterious mark is forgotten, replaced by pride in his newly acquired stitching skills. Later that evening, as Eleanor performs her usual check of the property's perimeter, a habit she's maintained religiously since Thomas's death, Scout's ears prick forward, his low growl alerting her to movement along the north ridge. Through the gathering dusk, she spots the flicker of a match, briefly illuminating a face beneath a wide-brimmed hat before darkness reclaims the hillside. Eleanor doesn't alter her routine, finishing her circuit of the property before returning, indoors, as if she's noticed nothing amiss. Once inside, however, she moves with a different purpose, lighting lamps in predictable locations to cast her shadow against the cabin's thin curtains, a shadow that any watcher would follow. In the privacy of her bedroom, she kneels beside the plain wooden chest at the foot of her bed. The brass key from her apron pocket slides into the lock, with practiced ease. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloths that have preserved it perfectly, lies a custom Sharps Model 1874 rifle. The octagonal barrel gleams in the lamplight, the walnut stock polished from years of handling. This is no ordinary homesteader's weapon for hunting game or deterring coyotes. This is a precision instrument capable of extraordinary accuracy in the right hands. Eleanor's hands, now ungloved, revealing the calluses and subtle powder burns that speak of countless rounds fired, move over the rifle with intimate familiarity. She checks the action, the trigger pull, each motion automatic after thousands of repetitions. From a hidden compartment in the chest, she removes a leather-bound journal filled with careful notations, distances, wind conditions, bullet trajectories, the meticulous records of a disciplined marksman. A name is inscribed on the journals. Cover in flowing script, Eleanor Eagle-Eye Winters, 1st Volunteer Sharpshooters. Before she was Mrs. Chambers, before she was a widow crafting leather in a remote homestead, Eleanor Winters had been something else entirely, something the three rough men in the general store, if they knew, would find terrifying rather than enticing. The rifle assembled and checked, Eleanor extinguishes the main lamps, creating the impression she's retired for the night. Any watchers on the ridge would see the cabin go dark, assuming the widow was safely abed. They wouldn't see her slip out the hidden cellar door, Scout padding silently at her heels, moving like a shadow across ground she knows by heart, rifle, cradled in arms that have lost none of their strength. Eleanor positions herself in a natural hollow beneath a cluster of boulders, a spot she prepared months ago with the foresight of someone who understands that in the Arizona territory, trouble eventually finds everyone. From this vantage point, she has clear sight lines to both her cabin and the ridge where she spotted the watcher. Through her brass telescope, she confirms what Scout's behavior already told her. 3 riders, their horses tethered in a draw below. The ridge line. She recognizes them from the store. The tall, scarred man and his 2 companions, now passing a bottle between them as they observe her darkened cabin. Their postures suggest patience, a willingness to wait until deep night before making their approach. Eleanor checks her timepiece, a man's pocket watch that had been Thomas's. Nearly 4 hours until midnight, when the moon will set and the riders will likely make their move, assuming the cabin occupant is deep in sleep. 4 hours, she whispers to Scout, who settles beside her, alert but calm. And then we'll remind them why this territory has rules, even when there aren't enough lawmen to enforce them. As she waits, Eleanor's mind drifts to the letter in her apron pocket, the one delivered by a Union captain 3 years ago, informing her not of Thomas's death in the line of duty, which she'd already been told, but of the true circumstances surrounding it. The letter, written by Thomas's commanding officer, explained how her husband had been betrayed, shot in the back by a supposed brother-in-law, who later deserted to lead a gang of outlaws across the Western Territories. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The commanding officer's description had been explicit. A tall man with a distinctive scar from eye to jaw, a scar given to him by Major Chambers in their final confrontation before the coward's bullet found its mark. As darkness deepens over the Arizona desert, Eleanor Chambers checks her rifle one final time. The Blackwell gang has made a fatal miscalculation. They've found the widow they've been searching for since leaving a trail of robberies and bodies across 3 territories, but they have no idea that the quiet woman in the isolated cabin isn't merely Thomas Chambers' grieving widow. She is Eleanor Eagle-Eye Winters, the most lethal scout sniper in the Union Army's secret sharpshooting corps, a woman whose existence was officially denied, but whose confirmed kills exceeded those of any male counterpart. A woman who had traded her rifle for leather tools and anonymity when Thomas proposed, seeking a peaceful life after too much death. And now, As she watches Cole Blackwell, the man who murdered her husband, ready himself to raid her home, Eleanor knows that peace was only ever a temporary respite. Through her scope, she studies his scarred face, calculating distance, wind, and bullet drop with the same precision that once made her a legend among the few who knew of her service. The desert night holds its breath, waiting for the vengeance that has been 3 years in the making. The rising sun bathes Copper Springs in golden light as Eleanor completes her morning ritual, a routine unchanged for 3 years. Unlike other women in town who rise to cook for husbands and children, Eleanor's discipline comes from a different source. Her movements follow the rhythms instilled during years of service that officially never happened. The small cabin, though modest from the outside, reveals careful modifications upon closer inspection. Window frames reinforced with hidden metal, plates, door hinges designed to remain silent, sight lines from every window offering clear views of approaching riders from all directions. These weren't the preparations of a typical frontier widow, but the calculated defenses of someone who understood that survival often depends on precious seconds of advance warning. Eleanor's property, 10 acres of hard-scrabble land that most considered barely worth farming, held strategic value that escaped casual observation. The elevated position against the red rock formation provided commanding views of the valley. The cottonwood grove concealed the cabin from the main trail. The bubbling creek that gave the property its name offered both water security and a constant ambient sound that masked quiet movements. Perfect defensive position, Thomas had remarked when they first discovered the plot 3 years ago, his military assessment automatic even as they planned their civilian life. Eleanor had noted the natural shooting lanes with the same instinctive evaluation, though neither spoke this aloud, both committed to leaving war behind them. Ironic, she thinks now, how they'd chosen this place for peace, only to have violence find them anyway. In her root cellar, deeper and more extensive than any neighbor would suspect, Eleanor maintained supplies that would raise questions if discovered. Ammunition stores, carefully organized by caliber and grain weight, preserved food sufficient for months, medical supplies that went beyond common household remedies. One shelf holds mysterious tins, labeled with a numerical system of her own devising, containing powders and compounds taught to her by a Cheyenne medicine woman whose life she'd once spared, and who later saved Thomas from fever when doctors had given up hope. Each morning, Eleanor checks these supplies with methodical efficiency, a habit that had once made Thomas smile and call her "my little quartermaster." The memory brings a brief curve to her lips before the familiar ache settles. Back in her chest, after her inspection, Eleanor moves to the small barn where her mare, Sadie, whinnies in greeting. The horse is no prize thoroughbred, but she possesses qualities Eleanor values more: endurance, sure-footedness, and most importantly, she doesn't spook at gunfire. Beside Sadie's stall stands a mule named Perseverance, Percy for short, stubborn and reliable for hauling her goods to town. "Morning patrol, Scout," she says quietly. The blue tick hound rises immediately, stretching before trotting to her. Side, together they walk the perimeter of the property, Eleanor's keen eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. Broken twigs, displaced rocks, indentations in the soft earth near the creek. She notes with grim satisfaction the evidence of last night's visitors: 3 cigarette butts beneath the ridge, a discarded whiskey bottle, a fragment of paper with partial writing. She pockets this last item without examining it closely, continuing her inspection without breaking stride. At the farthest corner of her property, where the boundary meets public land, Eleanor pauses at a small, unmarked stone. Scout sits respectfully as she kneels briefly, touching the smooth surface with ungloved fingers. No cross or inscription marks this spot, but here lies Shadow, Thomas's warhorse, who survived countless battles only to die protecting his master in their final confrontation with Cole Blackwell. The horse's sacrifice had given Thomas precious seconds, not enough to save his life, but enough to wound his killer with the knife strike that left the scar Eleanor recognized in town yesterday. It's also where Thomas had pressed the blood-stained letter into her hands with his final breath, revealing Blackwell's betrayal and the conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the territorial government. Rising, Eleanor whispers, "Soon," a promise to both the horse and its rider. Back at the cabin, she changes from her simple morning dress into her work clothes, split skirts of her own design that allow freedom of movement while maintaining a semblance of propriety. Only Ruth Miller has ever seen these practical garments, and the shopkeeper had been sworn to secrecy before creating several pairs to Eleanor's specifications. "Land sakes, Mrs. Chambers," Ruth had exclaimed during the fitting. "These make more sense than those ridiculous contraptions most ladies wear, though I reckon the Reverend's wife would have palpitations if she saw them." The memory brings a rare smile to Eleanor's face as she settles at her workbench on the covered porch, beginning the day's leatherwork. Her latest commission, a gun, a belt for Sheriff Cooper, requires particular attention to detail. The lawman had specifically requested her distinctive oak leaf design, a pattern she'd created that had become something of a signature among those who carried her work. What none of her customers realized was that each seemingly decorative element in her designs contained a functional purpose. The oak leaf pattern created subtle ridges that improved grip on the leather. The acorn embeddings reinforced stress points. Every stitch was double-backed in a technique she'd learned from a cavalry saddlemaster who discovered her secret and became one of her few allies during the war. As her hands work the leather, Eleanor's mind processes the information gathered during her morning patrol. The Blackwell gang's presence wasn't a coincidence. The discarded paper fragment confirmed it. She'd recognized Cole's handwriting immediately, though she wouldn't examine the contents until she was certain no one observed her. The distant sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupts her thoughts. Scout's ears prick forward, but his posture remains relaxed. A familiar visitor, then. Minutes later, Samuel Washington appears around the bend, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile beneath his gray-streaked beard. "Morning, Ms. Chambers," he calls, raising a hand in greeting. Samuel is among the few people Eleanor trusts implicitly. A former slave who'd fought for the Union and later established one of the territory's most respected horse-breeding operations. He shares her ability to recognize the unspoken truths behind official histories. "Mr. Washington," she acknowledges, setting aside her work. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Thought you might want to know," he says, dismounting with the fluid grace of a lifetime horseman despite his 60-odd years. "3 fellows have been asking about you in town, making a nuisance of themselves at the watering hole last night." Eleanor nods, unsurprised. "I encountered them at Miller's yesterday." Samuel's expression grows serious. "These ain't just ordinary saddle tramps, Ms. Chambers. Mitch Carver and the Delgado boy. Real bad sorts. And their leader." He hesitates. "Cole Blackwell?" Eleanor finishes for him, her voice steady. Samuel studies her face carefully. "You already knew." It isn't a question, but Eleanor answers anyway. "I recognized him." A moment of understanding passes between them. Samuel had never asked about her past, just as she'd never questioned the Spanish-made revolver he kept hidden beneath his coat, a weapon illegal for a man of color to possess in many places. "They're planning something," Samuel continues. "Overheard them talking about settling scores and finding the woman." Deputy Mason was too deep in his cups to notice. Eleanor's expression doesn't change, but her fingers tighten almost imperceptibly on the leather in her hands. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Washington." Samuel clears his throat. "There's something else. The telegraph came through for Sheriff Cooper yesterday. Seems the marshal won't be coming after all. Called away to handle troubles up north. The sheriff's trying to organize a town watch, but... He trails off, the implication clear. Cooper would find few volunteers willing to stand against the Blackwell gang, I see. Eleanor sets her leatherwork aside completely. Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Washington? I've just brewed a fresh pot. The invitation, uncharacteristic from the usually private widow, signals her recognition of the gravity of the situation. Samuel accepts with a nod, following her. Inside the cabin, once the door is closed, Eleanor moves to the window, checking their surroundings before pulling the curtain. Only then does she retrieve the paper fragment from her pocket, smoothing it carefully on the table between them. Blackwell's handwriting, she confirms, part of a map marking water sources between here and the Mexican border. Samuel studies it, his expression grim, plotting escape routes. Indeed, which means whatever they're planning in Copper Springs, they expect to need a fast departure. Eleanor moves to the fireplace, using iron tongs to remove a loose brick from the chimney. From the hollow behind it, she extracts a folded document. This arrived 2 months ago. Samuel takes the wanted poster, examining the crude likenesses of Cole Blackwell and his gang members. $2,500, he reads. Dead or alive. Note the crimes listed, Eleanor directs. Samuel's eyebrows rise as he reads aloud. Bank robbery, murder, treason. He looks up sharply. Treason? The military has been hunting Blackwell for 3 years, Eleanor explains. Not just for desertion or Thomas's murder. He stole something before he ran, something valuable enough that certain officials would prefer it recovered quietly, without the public learning it was missing. What could be worth that kind of trouble? Eleanor hesitates, weighing her trust in Samuel against the danger knowledge brings. Encryption codes, she finally answers, for military telegraphs across the Western Territories. With them, someone could intercept orders, redirect troops, facilitate ambushes, or create opportunities for something bigger. Samuel lets out a low whistle. Like robbing a payroll shipment. Precisely. Eleanor takes the poster back, returning it to its hiding place. The Army payroll for 3 forts is scheduled to pass through Copper Springs tomorrow afternoon, normally with heavy guard, but if someone had intercepted and altered the orders, understanding dawns in Samuel's eyes. That's why the marshal was suddenly called away, Eleanor nods, and why Blackwell has been moving systematically through towns along the route, establishing his presence, gathering information. But why come after you? Revenge for the scar. That and something more. Eleanor turns away, moving to the chest at the foot of her bed. The brass key appears in her hand, unlocking the hidden compartment beneath the false bottom where she'd concealed the most damning evidence of her past. She withdraws a small leather pouch, untying it carefully, before spilling its contents onto the table between them. A brass button from a Union officer's coat, encrusted with dried blood. Thomas managed to take this from Blackwell during their struggle, she explains. A keepsake Blackwell had been carrying, a trophy from another murder. I recognize the insignia immediately. Samuel examines the button. General's rank. Eleanor's voice turns cold. General Edward Hollister, Thomas's commanding officer and my former handler in the Sharpshooter division, officially reported killed by Confederate snipers near Appomattox, actually murdered by Cole Blackwell 3 days after the surrender was signed. Why? Because Hollister knew what Blackwell really was. A traitor who'd been selling information to both sides throughout the war. After the surrender, Blackwell needed to eliminate anyone who could expose him before he vanished west with his accumulated blood money. Eleanor moves to the window again, gazing toward the ridge where she'd spotted the watchers the previous night. Thomas figured it out too late. We'd already settled here when he received a message from an old war comrade warning him about Blackwell. That's when Thomas told me everything, how Blackwell had wormed his way into Hollister's confidence, gained access to the codes, and was planning one final betrayal. Samuel's expression grows troubled. And now Blackwell's discovered where you are. He's always known, Eleanor corrects him. Thomas's dying words warned me that Blackwell would come eventually. The question was never if, but when. She turns back to face Samuel, her composure absolute despite the weight of her revelation. And why now, after 3 years? The payroll, Samuel concludes. Perhaps, but there's something else. Eleanor retrieves her husband's pocket watch, opening it to reveal a small, folded paper hidden behind the timepiece, the letter she always carries. She doesn't show Samuel its contents, but summarizes. Thomas believed Blackwell wasn't working alone. Someone with authority was protecting him, facilitating his movements across territories where he should have been captured a dozen times over. Someone who could call away a federal marshal at the perfect moment, Samuel adds, understanding. Exactly. Eleanor closes the watch, her decision made. Mr. Washington, I have a favor to ask. Samuel straightens. Name it. Take Scout with you when you leave. My neighbors, the Anderson family, their daughter Sarah has always been fond of him. Tell them. She hesitates. Tell them I've gone to visit my sister in Tucson. You don't have a sister, Samuel points out. They don't know that. Eleanor's smile is tight. By the time they discover otherwise, this will be finished one way or another. Samuel studies her for a long moment. You're setting yourself as bait. I'm ending a hunt that's gone on too long. At least let me bring some men. Eleanor shakes, her head sharply. Blackwell has at least 2 Confederates with him that we know of. There could be others, and we still don't know who his powerful ally might be. The fewer people involved, the better. You can't face them alone, Samuel insists. I won't be alone, Eleanor replies, her gaze shifting briefly to the rifle case visible beneath her bed, and I won't be unprepared. Understanding the steel behind her quiet words, Samuel nods reluctantly. What else can I do? Tomorrow, when the payroll comes through, watch Sheriff Cooper. If he's innocent, he'll need support. If not, she doesn't finish the thought. And the town? Keep people away from Main Street after noon. Whatever happens will happen quickly. Rising to leave, Samuel pauses at the door. You know, folks wonder why you stay out here all alone. Some think it's grief. And what do you think, Mr. Washington? His eyes hold hers steadily. I think some forests need fire to clear away the dead growth before new life can begin. After Samuel departs with a reluctant Scout, Eleanor retrieves the paper fragment she'd collected earlier, studying it more carefully. The partial map confirms her suspicions. Blackwell has an extraction plan ready. But there's something else. A notation in the margin half burned away. H confirms special cargo secure, triple payment on delivery. The H troubles her. Could it be Hargrove, the banker, Hopkins at the telegraph office, or someone higher in territorial authority? Eleanor places the fragment with her other evidence, then moves purposefully through the cabin, gathering what she'll need. From beneath, a loose floorboard, comes a small wooden box containing telegraph keys and wire, tools from her scouting days when she'd tap into Confederate lines to gather intelligence. From the root cellar, she selects specific ammunition, custom loads she'd crafted herself for maximum accuracy with her Sharps rifle. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor has transformed her cabin into a carefully staged scene. To casual observation, it appears that the widow is preparing for a journey, clothes laid out, traveling valise open on the bed. Yet concealed around the property are the tools of her true preparation: sightline markers, rangefinders, and carefully positioned mirrors to eliminate blind spots. When Billy Thompson arrives with a message from Ruth Miller about a fabric order, Eleanor greets him with unusual warmth, even offering him cookies she'd baked that morning. Mrs. Miller says the calico you ordered won't be in until next week, Billy reports, happily accepting the treat. She wants to know if the blue would suit instead. The blue will be fine, Eleanor responds, pressing a folded note into his hand. Please give her this as well. It's the pattern for a new saddlebag she expressed interest in. In reality, the note contains a carefully worded warning and instructions for Ruth to ensure her family remains safely away from Main Street the following day. Ruth, a woman of uncommon intelligence despite her limited education, would understand both the explicit and implicit messages. Yes, ma'am. Billy pockets the note, then hesitates. Mrs. Chambers, those men from yesterday were asking about you in town. The tall one with the scar, he offered me 2 bits to tell him about your place here. Eleanor's expression remains composed. Did you accept his offer? Billy looks scandalized. Course not. My pa would tan my hide if I took money to gossip about a lady. He straightens proudly. I told him if he wanted to know about Mrs. Chambers, he should call on you properly, like a gentleman. Despite the gravity of the situation, Eleanor feels a genuine smile touch her lips. That was well said, Billy. Thank you. After the boy leaves, Eleanor moves to her bedroom, kneeling beside the chest containing her rifle. Tonight would be her final preparation. Tomorrow, Cole Blackwell would discover what happened to men who underestimated Eleanor Eagle Eye Winters. As dusk falls, she removes her gloves, flexing fingers marked with the calluses of a marksman. From a hidden compartment in her dressing table, she withdraws a small tin of specialized gun oil, a formula of her own creation that minimized flash and smoke. Methodically, she begins cleaning her Sharps rifle, each movement a meditation on the task to come. The widow of Cottonwood Creek had been silent for 3 years. Tomorrow, her rifle will speak for her. The town of Copper Springs stirs to life under the morning sun, unaware of the silent war about to erupt in its dusty streets. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, Mitch Carver and Luis Delgado nurse whiskeys despite the early hour, their red-rimmed eyes suggesting they'd never sought their beds the previous night. Nearby, Cole Blackwell studies a crude map spread across the sticky table, occasionally making notations with a stubby pencil. Don't see why we're wasting time on one woman, Delgado mutters, his Mexican accent thickened by liquor. The payroll's coming through with or without her. Blackwell doesn't look up from his map. The widow knows things that could complicate our plans. She's just some craftswoman, Carver interjects. Folks say she barely speaks 2 words together. Now Blackwell raises his eyes, the scar on his face pulling tight as he smiles without humor. That's what folks are supposed to think. He taps the map decisively. Tonight, we will pay her a visit. Before tomorrow's main event. At the opposite end of Main Street, Sheriff William Cooper unlocks the jailhouse door, his movement slowed by a troubling weight on his mind. The telegraph he'd received yesterday still sits folded in his pocket. Marshal detained, stop payroll, rerouted your jurisdiction, stop maintain absolute secrecy, stop. Cooper hangs his hat on the rack, running a hand through thinning hair as he contemplates his predicament. $12,000 in gold coming through his town, and not a single deputy he can fully trust. Mason drinks too much, Parker's barely 20 with no experience of real violence, and Reynolds has been acting strangely ever since he returned from that trip to Tucson last month. The bell above the door jingles as Hopkins from the telegraph office enters, clutching a yellow paper in his trembling hand. Another one, Sheriff, he says, voice low despite the empty jailhouse. Just came through. Cooper accepts the telegram, reading quickly. Blackwell gang reported your vicinity. Stop considered armed and extremely dangerous. Stop additional support. Impossible before Thursday. Stop. Thursday. 2 days after the payroll shipment will have already passed through. Cooper crumples the paper in his fist. Anyone else see this? Hopkins shakes his head. Come direct to me, coded, Army transmission. Keep it that way. Cooper reaches, into his desk drawer, withdrawing a small canvas bag that clinks as he hands it to Hopkins. "For your discretion." After the telegraph operator departs, Cooper moves to the window, gazing down the length of Main Street toward the Silver Dollar. Through the grimy windows, he can just make out the silhouettes of 3 men hunched over a table. His hand unconsciously moves to the oak leaf tool belt at his waist. Eleanor Chambers' fine craftsmanship, commissioned just 2 weeks ago. The widow's face flashes in his mind, her composed features, eyes that miss nothing, hands too graceful for the frontier. There had always been something about her that nagged at him, something that didn't quite fit the story of a simple craftsman's. Widow, perhaps it was time to pay her another visit. At Miller's General Store, Ruth examines the note Eleanor sent with young Billy Thompson, her brow furrowed in concentration as she deciphers the seemingly innocent instructions for a saddle pattern. Ruth had known Eleanor long enough to recognize when the widow was speaking between the lines. The note mentioned staying away from the afternoon sun on Main Street tomorrow due to dangerous elements that might damage delicate fabrics. It requested Ruth to ensure fragile items are secured in the back room, particularly around 2 o'clock, and suggested she visit her sister in Pine Creek until the weather clears. Ruth folds the note carefully, tucking it into her bodice. In 3 years, Eleanor had never sent such a warning. Whatever was coming to Copper Springs, Ruth intended to be well clear of it and to take her family with her. As she begins composing a "closed for family emergency" sign to hang in the store window tomorrow, the bell above the door announces a customer. Ruth looks up to find Cole Blackwell himself, standing in her shop, his imposing figure blocking much of the morning light. "Good day, Mom," he greets her, removing his hat with a politeness that doesn't reach his cold eyes. "I understand. You're acquainted with the widow out at Cottonwood Creek." Ruth's heart pounds, but her voice remains steady. "Mrs. Chambers, certainly. She's a regular customer. Did you have business with her?" "You might say that." Blackwell moves toward the counter, placing his hat down as he examines the merchandise. Display with affected interest. "I knew her husband during the war. Thought I might pay my respects, but I'd hate to intrude on her grief if she's still delicate." "That's very considerate," Ruth replies, her fingers closing around the small derringer her husband insists she keep beneath the counter. "Mrs. Chambers is a private person, but I'm sure she appreciates condolences, even after these years." 3 years, isn't it?" Blackwell asks casually, though something in his tone suggests he knows the answer precisely. "About that, yes." Blackwell's scarred face twists into what might be intended as a sympathetic expression. "Terrible business losing. The major like that. Ambush, wasn't it? Indians, I heard." Ruth's grip on the derringer tightens. Eleanor had never discussed the specific circumstances of her husband's death, but Ruth had pieced together enough to know it wasn't Apaches who'd widowed her friend. "I couldn't say," she answers carefully. "Mrs. Chambers doesn't speak of it." "Understandable." Blackwell nods, his eyes scanning the store meticulously, missing nothing, including, Ruth notices with a chill, the half-completed closed sign she'd been writing. "I understand she sells leather goods, fine craftsmanship from what I hear." "The finest in the territory," Ruth confirms, sliding the sign casually beneath a bolt of fabric. Sheriff Cooper swears by her gun belts. At the mention of the sheriff, something flickers behind Blackwell's eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or confirmation of something already suspected. "Is that so? I may need a new belt myself." He retrieves his hat, placing a silver dollar on the counter, though he's purchased nothing. "For your trouble, Mom. Perhaps you could tell me the best trail out to the widow's place." Ruth forces a smile. The main road past the creek is most direct, though the ridge trail offers a prettier view. Blackwell tips his hat. "Much obliged. Good day to you." The moment the door closes behind him, Ruth retrieves Eleanor's note, reading it once. More before burning it in the small stove at the back of the store. She's known hardship and danger, all frontier women do, but something about Cole Blackwell leaves her convinced that tomorrow will bring violence of a different order to Copper Springs. Out at Cottonwood Creek, Eleanor stands in the center of her cabin, taking a final inventory of her preparations. The morning has been productive. She moved essential supplies to a hidden cache in the rocks behind the property, set up subtle markers at precise distances along likely approach routes, and positioned her mirrors to eliminate blind spots around the cabin's perimeter. From the outside, everything appears normal. Laundry hanging on the line, smoke rising from the chimney, Percy the mule grazing contentedly in the small paddock. Only the absence of Scout disrupts the usual tableau, but Samuel Washington had departed with the hound at first light, promising to keep him safe at his horse ranch until the business is concluded. Eleanor opens her ammunition box, counting the custom cartridges she's prepared, 23 rounds, each loaded with meticulous precision for her Sharps rifle. More than enough, if her suspicions prove correct about Blackwell's manpower. A distant sound catches her attention. Hoofbeats approaching, but from the canyon trail rather than the main road. Eleanor moves swiftly to the window, using a small, polished signal mirror to check the ridgeline without exposing herself. A flash of sunlight on metal reveals a rider moving along the high trail that overlooks her property, his field glasses trained on her cabin. Eleanor recognizes the silhouette. Immediately, Sheriff William Cooper. His presence on the ridge, rather than approaching directly, tells her something has changed in the lawman's assessment of the situation. He's being cautious now, observing before committing himself. She considers her options. Cooper represents a variable she hasn't fully accounted for. His loyalty remains questionable. The new gun belt she crafted for him had provided opportunities to study his hands, his posture, his reactions when certain topics arose. Nothing conclusive had emerged, but Eleanor's instincts whispered caution. Making a swift decision, she moves to the front door, opening it wide and stepping onto the porch as if to shake out a rug, making herself visible to the watching sheriff. She raises a hand in greeting, conveying that she's spotted him, then gestures toward the main trail, an invitation to approach properly rather than skulk on the ridgeline. Cooper hesitates visibly, then raises his hand in acknowledgement before turning his horse toward the main trail. Eleanor returns inside to prepare coffee, knowing it will be expected. This conversation might determine whether Cooper becomes an ally or an obstacle in tomorrow's confrontation. 15 minutes later, the sheriff's horse appears around the bend in the trail. Eleanor, now seated at her workbench, meticulously tooling a leather bracelet, looks up as if just noticing his arrival. "Sheriff Cooper," she greets him, setting aside her work. "Twice in 2 days. I hope nothing's amiss." Cooper dismounts, securing his horse to the hitching post. "Just checking on outlying homesteads, Mrs. Chambers. There've been reports of strangers in the area." "How conscientious," Eleanor replies, her tone neutral. "Would you care for coffee?" Inside the cabin, Cooper's eyes roam restlessly, noting the traveling valise on the bed, the clothes laid out as if for packing. "Planning a trip, Mrs. Chambers?" "A brief one," Eleanor confirms, pouring coffee into a tin mug for him. "My sister in Tucson has been unwell." "Funny," Cooper says, accepting the coffee but not drinking. "In 3 years, you've never mentioned a sister." Eleanor meets his gaze steadily. "You've never asked about my family, Sheriff." A tense silence stretches between them, broken when Cooper finally takes a sip of his coffee before speaking again. "I encountered Cole Blackwell in town yesterday. The name isn't familiar to me," Eleanor lies smoothly. "Tall fellow, distinctive scar on his face. Mentioned he knew your husband during the war." Eleanor's expression reveals nothing, but she notes the deliberate test in Cooper's statement. "Many men knew Thomas during the war, Sheriff. He was an officer with considerable responsibilities. Blackwell seemed particularly interested in paying his respects to you personally." How thoughtful, Eleanor responds, her tone dry. Though, if his manners in town reflect his character, I doubt Thomas counted him a close friend. Cooper sets down his coffee, his demeanor shifting subtly. Mrs. Chambers, I'm going to speak plainly. Something's coming to Copper Springs, something bad. These men aren't just passing through, they're planning something, and I suspect it involves tomorrow's payroll shipment. Eleanor raises an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Payroll shipment? Army? Gold for 3/4, passing under guard tomorrow afternoon. Cooper watches her reaction closely. Highly confidential information. Yet you're sharing it with me, Eleanor observes. Why? Cooper's hand moves unconsciously to the gun belt she crafted, fingers tracing the oak leaf pattern as if drawing strength from it. Because my deputy went missing this morning, because the marshal who should be here was mysteriously reassigned, because I've got 3 known killers sitting in my town, and I'm starting to think they're not the only threat I'm facing. Eleanor makes a decision. Rising from her chair, she moves to the fireplace, retrieving the fragment of map she discovered. I found this outside my property yesterday morning. It appears to be part of a route to the Mexican border. Cooper examines it, his expression grim. Escape route, well planned. Note the handwriting, Eleanor suggests, and the partial initial in the margin. The sheriff's face pales slightly as he recognizes the implications. H confirms special cargo secure, he reads aloud. Hargrove at the bank. Perhaps, Eleanor allows. Or someone with higher authority who can reroute federal marshals and access information about payroll shipments. Cooper looks up sharply. How do you know about the marshal being rerouted? Eleanor meets his gaze steadily, offering half of the truth. Because the same person who wants the payroll has been hunting me for 3 years, Sheriff. Cole Blackwell. Didn't know my husband from the war. He knew him because Blackwell is the man who murdered him. Cooper absorbs this, connecting pieces in his mind. Your husband wasn't killed by Apaches, was he? No. Eleanor takes back the map fragment, returning it to its hiding place. Thomas was investigating Blackwell for treason, stealing military codes, selling information. He discovered evidence linking Blackwell to someone powerful in the territorial government, someone who's been facilitating these robberies across 3 territories. Why didn't you come to me with this? Because until this moment, Sheriff, I wasn't certain which side you were on. Cooper's expression hardens. And now I believe you're an honest lawman caught in a dangerous situation, Eleanor answers. But that still doesn't tell me how far you're willing to go to protect your town. The sheriff stands, moving to the window to gaze out toward the ridge where Blackwell's men had watched the previous night. What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Chambers? I'm suggesting, Sheriff Cooper, that tomorrow afternoon, Cole Blackwell and his men will attempt to rob the payroll shipment on Main Street. They'll expect minimal resistance because someone has ensured your usual support is absent. And this H, will likely have other agents in position, Cooper concludes, maybe even among my own deputies. Eleanor nods. Which means you can trust no one. Cooper turns back to face her, his expression troubled. No offense, Mrs. Chambers, but you're just one woman, a civilian. What exactly do you propose to do about this situation? For answer, Eleanor moves to her bedroom, returning with the wooden chest. Cooper watches in stunned silence as she unlocks it, revealing the Sharp's rifle nestled in its custom bed of oiled cloth. Sweet Jesus, he breathes, recognizing the weapon for what it is, not a common hunting rifle, but a precision instrument. Of war, Sheriff Cooper, Eleanor says quietly. I think it's time you knew who really lives at Cottonwood Creek. From the inner compartment of the chest, she withdraws a folded document bearing the seal of the United States Army. Cooper accepts it with visible trepidation, unfolding the yellowed paper to read, By order of President Abraham Lincoln, Eleanor. Winters is hereby commissioned as Special Scout to the 1st Volunteer Sharpshooters. Her rank, duties, and existence shall remain confidential, known only to commanding officers with appropriate clearance. The document is dated 1863, signed by a general whose name Cooper recognizes from history books. Eagle Eye, Cooper whispers, using a name he's heard only in whispered legends among former soldiers. They said you could hit a man at 800 yards and split playing cards at 100. That you killed 50 Confederate officers so precisely they thought it was the hand of God. Eleanor's face remains impassive. 53. And I assure you, Sheriff, there was nothing divine about it. Just mathematics, patience, and a steady hand. Cooper looks between the document and the composed woman standing before him, reconciling the quiet widow with the deadly legend. After the war, Thomas and I married. We came west, seeking peace. Eleanor's voice remains level, but something flickers behind her eyes. We found it briefly, until Blackwell tracked him down. And now Blackwell has found you too. Cooper rubs his jaw thoughtfully. But he doesn't know what you really are. No, Eleanor confirms. He believes he's dealing with a helpless widow, a mistake that will cost him dearly. Cooper hands back the document, his decision made. What do you need from me? Keep civilians off Main Street tomorrow afternoon. Position yourself where you can observe without being obvious. And most importantly, watch for whoever moves to assist Blackwell when the shooting starts. That will be our H. And you? Eleanor's. Smile is cold and precise as rifle fire. I'll be where I'm most effective, Sheriff. At a distance, unnoticed, with clear sight lines. Cooper nods, extending his hand. As Eleanor takes it, he notices for the first time the calluses beneath her gloves, the distinctive markings of a sharpshooter. I'll need to return to town before my absence raises questions, he says. But know that whatever happens tomorrow, you have an ally. After Cooper departs, Eleanor moves quickly, making final preparations now that her timeline has accelerated. Blackwell's visit to Ruth Miller suggests he's gathering information, finalizing his approach. His interest in her property's access routes indicates he'll come tonight, rather than wait for morning. Eleanor changes into dark trousers and a black shirt, clothes she's kept hidden since her scouting days. Around her neck, she places a silver chain, bearing Thomas's wedding ring next to a small brass compass he'd given her on their first anniversary. Practical items, but the only sentimentality she allows herself before what's to come. As shadows lengthen across Cottonwood Creek, Eleanor Chambers vanishes. In her place stands Eleanor Eagle Eye Winters, the most lethal sharpshooter of the Union Army, preparing for one final mission. The Sharp's rifle, freshly cleaned and loaded, finds its familiar place in her hands. Eleanor takes up position in a concealed observation post she constructed months ago in the rocks overlooking her property. From here, she can see every approach to the cabin, every shadow, every movement. The afternoon light fades into dusk, then into the deep blue of desert twilight. In the distance, coyotes begin their nightly chorus. Eleanor remains motionless, her breathing slow and controlled, her focus absolute. She does not have to wait long. As the first stars appear, 3 riders approach from the canyon trail, moving with the deliberate stealth of men who believe themselves unobserved. Through her scope, Eleanor identifies Cole Blackwell leading Mitch Carver and Luis Delgado. They dismount at the edge of her property, securing their horses out of sight before continuing on foot. The hunt that began 3 years ago is reaching its conclusion. But this time, the hunters have become the hunted, and they have no idea they've already entered the sights of Eagle Eye. Moonlight bathes the Cottonwood Creek property in silver as Cole Blackwell signals his men to spread out. Through her scope, Eleanor tracks their movements with cold precision. Blackwell himself approaches from the front, while Carver circles toward the rear door. Delgado edges toward the barn, presumably to ensure no horses are available for escape. Amateurs, Eleanor whispers to herself. Their deployment reveals they expect to find a sleeping widow, easily subdued, with no concept of perimeter security or tactical positioning. She allows herself one small smile before focusing on Delgado, the closest target. Through her scope, she can see the Mexican outlaw's features clearly. The pockmarked face, the nervous eyes that keep darting toward the shadows. His inexperience makes him careless. He steps directly into one of her prepared markers. Eleanor steadies her breathing. The distance is approximately 200 yards, a shot she could make blindfolded after her years of training. But she doesn't fire, not yet. Information comes before elimination, and Blackwell's operation still holds too many unknowns. Instead, she watches as Carver reaches the back door, extracting lockpicks from his vest pocket. The outlaw works on the simple door lock, unaware that Eleanor deliberately left it unlocked. Another invitation they can't resist. The front door, conversely, is barricaded from the inside, forcing them to follow her choreographed path. Blackwell positions himself beside the front window, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. Eleanor notes how he keeps his body angled, minimizing his profile, a soldier's habit. Unlike his companions, Blackwell moves with the practiced caution of a man who understands combat, who recognizes potential danger. Still, his confidence betrays him. He believes he's hunting a helpless woman, not being drawn into a sniper's carefully laid trap. Through a strategically positioned mirror in the cabin, Eleanor observes Carver slipping inside, revolver drawn. She knows exactly what he'll find. A cabin that appears hastily abandoned, traveling clothes laid across the bed, a half-eaten meal on the table, embers still glowing in the fireplace. All evidence suggesting the widow fled with minimal warning. Carver reappears at the front door, unlocking it to admit Blackwell. Even at this distance, Eleanor can read the confusion in their body language. Blackwell's hand signals reveal his displeasure, ordering Delgado to search the barn while he and Carver investigate the cabin further. Now comes the first test of her preparations. Beneath certain floorboards inside the cabin lie pressure triggers, connected to small percussive devices, not lethal, but designed to create controlled chaos. As Blackwell steps into the main room, a muffled thump sounds from within, followed by a flash of light visible through the windows. Delgado panics, drawing his weapon and firing wildly toward the cabin. Blackwell emerges on the porch, cursing, audibly even at this distance. "Hold your fire, you idiot," he shouts. "It's just a diversion." Through her scope, Eleanor sees blood on Blackwell's face, a minor injury from her trap, nothing more. She watches him wipe it away with cold fury, his scarred features twisted with rage. "She knew we were coming," he tells Carver, who emerges coughing from the smoke. "Check the perimeter. She can't have gone far." Eleanor shifts her position slightly, maintaining her sight line while reducing the chance of detection. Blackwell's reaction confirms her suspicion. He needs her alive, at least temporarily. Had he simply wanted revenge for Thomas, he could have burned the cabin with her inside it. No, he's seeking something specific. She watches as the men spread out, beginning a search pattern around the property. Carver heads toward the creek, while Delgado reluctantly examines the dark spaces around the barn. Blackwell himself returns to the cabin, methodically searching through her belongings, through a small gap in the cabin's roof, a modification she'd made specifically for this purpose. Eleanor can track his movements from room to room. He ignores her clothes, her personal items, focusing instead on potential hiding places, loose floorboards, hollow walls, the space beneath her bed. When he discovers the empty chest that once held her Sharp's rifle, his reaction is immediate and violent. He overturns the simple wooden table, smashing a lantern against the wall in frustration. "Looking for this," Eleanor whispers, though he can't possibly hear her. Her finger caresses the trigger of the very weapon he's seeking, a grim appreciation. For the irony, Blackwell emerges from the cabin, summoning his men with a sharp whistle. As they regroup on the porch, their conversation carries clearly through the still desert night. "She's gone," Carver states the obvious. "Must have spooked after your visit to the store today." Blackwell's backhanded strike catches Carver across the face, sending him stumbling. "She didn't spook, you imbecile, she was warned." He paces the porch, calculating replacing anger. "Someone in town tipped her off. We need to find out who." "What about tomorrow's job?" Delgado asks nervously. "Are we still going through with it?" "Of course we are," Blackwell snaps. "Everything's set. Harrison has the military escort diverted. The bankers cooperating. By this time tomorrow we'll be halfway to Mexico with 12,000 in army gold." Eleanor's breath catches. Harrison, the territorial judge who travels between counties on a monthly circuit. The H from the map fragment. A circuit judge would have the authority to reroute marshals, access information about payroll shipments, and provide the perfect cover for coordinating robberies across multiple jurisdictions. She files this information away, continuing to observe as Blackwell regains his composure, issuing new orders to his men. "Torch the place," he commands. "If she returns, she'll find nothing but ashes. Then we head back to town. There's one person who might know where she's gone." As Carver disappears inside to gather lamp oil, Eleanor carefully lines up her first shot of the night. Not at any of the men, but at the barn where Delgado has just tossed a lit match onto a hay bale. The crack of her rifle shatters the night silence, the bullet extinguishing the flame with precision that seems supernatural to anyone unfamiliar with her abilities. The reaction is immediate. Delgado throws himself flat, while Carver bolts from the cabin, abandoning his arson attempt. Blackwell, however, drops into a combat crouch, his experienced eyes scanning the ridgeline. "Sniper!" he shouts, drawing his revolver, though it's useless at this range. "On the North Ridge." Eleanor is already moving, executing the exit strategy she'd prepared. By the time Blackwell organizes his men to investigate the ridge, she'll be repositioned a quarter-mile east, with clear sightlines to observe their next move. Sure enough, Blackwell sends Carver scrambling up the rocky slope, while he and Delgado take cover behind the cabin wall. Eleanor watches through her scope as Carver reaches her former position, finding nothing but a spent cartridge, carefully left as a calling card. When Carver reports back, Blackwell's rage is evident even at this distance. But beneath the anger, Eleanor detects something else in his posture, recognition. He knows now that he's not dealing with an ordinary widow. The shot that extinguished the match was a message, a demonstration of skill that few living people could match. "She's toying with us," Blackwell tells his men, his voice carrying on the night air. "Let's see how she plays when we change the game." He turns to Delgado. "Ride back to town. Tell Harrison we need leverage. The storekeeper, Miller's wife. Bring her out here at dawn." As Delgado mounts up, Eleanor faces her first genuine dilemma of the night. She could easily eliminate the outlaw before he reaches town, but doing so would sacrifice her tactical advantage. Blackwell would immediately recognize the threat and alter his plans, potentially endangering more civilians. Instead, she tracks Delgado's progress until he crests the ridge, then quickly repositions to a vantage point overlooking the trail to town. She'll allow him to ride a specific distance before taking action. Far enough that Blackwell won't hear the shot, but soon enough to prevent him from reaching Copper Springs. The night vision techniques she perfected during the war serve her well as she navigates the familiar terrain without noise or visible movement. Unlike city-bred outlaws, Eleanor understands the desert's nocturnal rhythms, how sound carries across valleys, how moonlight creates both concealment and exposure, and how patience often determines survival. She reaches her secondary position, just as Delgado's silhouette appears against the starlit sky. The distance is considerable, nearly 400 yards with a slight crosswind from the west. Eleanor calculates adjustments automatically, her body remembering formulas her conscious mind has long since internalized. This time, she doesn't aim for the rider, but for his mount, specifically the saddle strap. The rifle's report echoes off canyon walls as her bullet severs the leather precisely where it connects to the metal buckle. Delgado manages 10 more yards before the saddle slips sideways, dumping him unceremoniously onto the hard-packed trail. By the time he regains his feet, cursing fluently in Spanish, Eleanor has circled behind him, approaching silently from downwind. Scout would have alerted to her presence, but Delgado lacks the hound's keen senses. He doesn't hear her until the cold barrel of her secondary weapon, a Tai, Navy Colt revolver, presses against the base of his skull. "Hello, Mr. Delgado," Eleanor says softly, the first words she's spoken aloud since nightfall. "I believe you were looking for me." The outlaw freezes, his hand halfway to his own weapon. "How did you—" "Remove your gun belt," slowly. Her voice is calm, almost conversational, yet carries absolute authority. When he complies, she continues, "Now, you're going to tell me everything about Judge Harrison's involvement in tomorrow's robbery." "I don't know what you're talking about, lady," Delgado attempts, his bravado undermined by the tremor in his voice. Eleanor sighs. "Let me be clear, Mr. Delgado. The bullet that unseated you could just as easily have removed your head from your shoulders. The fact that you're still breathing is a temporary courtesy that depends entirely on your cooperation." To emphasize her point, she fires a shot that parts his hair, the bullet so close he feels its heat against his scalp. The precision makes his eyes widen in terror. "Dios mío," he whispers, "you're her, the ghost from the war." Eleanor doesn't bother confirming or denying this assessment. Harrison's plan, now! Delgado's resistance crumbles. The judge arranged everything. He got the information about the payroll route, arranged for the marshal to be called away. Tomorrow, when the shipment arrives, Sheriff Cooper will be summoned to the bank on a false emergency. The army escort will receive orders to proceed. Without him? And then? Blackwell and his men create a distraction on the south end of town, fire at the livery stable. When the guards investigate, we take the gold. Simple. Eleanor considers this information. "How many men besides you three?" "2. More arriving by morning. Former soldiers who served with Blackwell. Good shots." Delgado swallows hard. "Harrison will be at the bank, ready to open the vault where the gold will be temporarily stored." And my role in all this. Why is Blackwell so interested in one widow? Delgado hesitates, earning himself another press of the revolver barrel. "Your husband," he finally admits. "The major had papers, evidence against Harrison and others. Blackwell thought you might have them." "What kind of evidence?" "Don't know exactly. Something about codes and operations during the war. Harrison paid Blackwell to eliminate anyone who knew about it. Your husband was on the list." The final pieces fall into place. Thomas hadn't just stumbled onto Blackwell's treason by chance. He'd been systematically gathering evidence against a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. A conspiracy that had continued after his death, using stolen military codes to orchestrate precisely timed robberies. Across the West, one last question, Mr. Delgado. The special cargo mentioned on your map, what is it? The outlaw's fear intensifies visibly. "Not cargo, a person. Harrison's arranged for someone to meet us at the border crossing. Someone from Washington who'll pay triple for the codes and the ledger." "What ledger?" "The one recording all their operations since '65. Names, dates, amounts. Harrison keeps it in a hidden compartment in his saddle." Eleanor processes this information quickly. The conspiracy is larger than she'd imagined, extending beyond the territory into the federal government. The special cargo isn't gold, but information, evidence that could implicate officials at the highest levels. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Delgado," she says calmly. Before he can respond, she strikes him precisely at the base of the skull with her revolver butt. He crumples unconscious but alive, one less threat to manage immediately, but still available for testimony if needed later. After securing him with his own belt and neckerchief, Eleanor returns to her observation post overlooking her cabin. As expected, Blackwell has grown impatient, waiting for Delgado's return. He and Carver are mounting up, presumably to investigate the delay. Eleanor allows herself a grim smile. The complex game she's orchestrated is proceeding exactly as planned. By removing Delgado from the equation without killing him, she's created uncertainty in Blackwell's mind. Not knowing if his man deserted or was captured amplifies the pressure, potentially forcing errors in judgment. She observes as Blackwell and Carver ride toward town rather than following Delgado's trail, another miscalculation that provides her with critical time. Once they're out of sight, Eleanor returns to her cabin, retrieving essential supplies she'd hidden beneath the floorboards. Of the root cellar, items too valuable to abandon, but too incriminating to carry initially. Among these is a small tin box containing military telegraph codes, not the originals Blackwell stole, but copies Thomas had made before his death. Worthless to the conspirators since the army changed their ciphers after the theft, but valuable as evidence of the original crime. More importantly, the box contains a detailed letter in Thomas's hand, naming Judge Harrison and 2 federal officials as conspirators in a scheme to sell military information. The letter is addressed to the territorial governor, evidence Thomas never had the chance to deliver. Eleanor secures these items in a specially designed pocket sewn into her jacket lining, then sets about implementing the next phase of her plan. From a hidden cache in the rocks behind her cabin, she retrieves pre-measured packages of black powder, fuses, and her most specialized ammunition, custom rounds created for maximum accuracy at extreme distances. By the time false dawn begins, to lighten the eastern sky, Eleanor has vanished from Cottonwood Creek once more, leaving behind a series of carefully planned surprises for when Blackwell inevitably returns. Her route takes her toward Copper Springs, but not directly. First, she has a rendezvous with Sheriff Cooper at the abandoned mining office a mile outside town, a meeting point they'd agreed upon during his visit. Cooper is already waiting when she arrives, his horse tethered inside the dilapidated structure. To avoid detection, his expression reveals both relief at her arrival and shock at her transformation. Gone is the quiet widow in modest dress, replaced by a figure in dark men's clothing, her hair tightly braided and tucked beneath a flat-brimmed hat, her movements fluid and predatory. "Mrs. Chambers," he greets her, the name sounding incongruous given her current appearance. "My husband called me Ellie," she replies, unslinging her rifle case. "Given the circumstances, perhaps you should do the same." Cooper nods, accepting. The subtle shift in their relationship from formal acquaintances to allies in combat. Blackwell and Carver rode into town an hour ago. They've taken rooms above the saloon. No sign of Delgado. "Delgado won't be joining them," Eleanor states, offering no further explanation as she unpacks her Sharps rifle. "I've confirmed Judge Harrison is their inside man. He's arranged for you to be called away when the payroll arrives." Cooper's face darkens. "Harrison? Damn it, I've known him for years. He's been running this operation across 3 territories since the war ended," Eleanor continues, checking her rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "Tomorrow's robbery is significant not just for the gold, but for a ledger Harrison carries, documenting all their operations, evidence that could implicate officials in Washington. The sheriff absorbs this information, his expression grim. We're talking about high treason then, not just robbery." "Precisely, which is why we need to proceed carefully." Eleanor withdraws a rudimentary map of Main Street she's sketched from memory. The payroll arrives at 2 o'clock. The distraction at the livery stable will follow immediately. 2 additional gunmen are joining Blackwell by morning. Former soldiers, according to Delgado. Good shots. Cooper studies the map. "Where do you need me?" Eleanor points to the roof of the hardware store. Elevated position, good cover, clear sight lines to both the bank and the livery. When the fire starts, don't react immediately. Wait until the guards leave their positions, then move to protect the shipment. "And you?" Eleanor indicates the church. "Steeple across from the bank. I'll handle Blackwell and his reinforcements. Your priority is Judge Harrison. Don't let him destroy that ledger." Cooper's eyes narrow slightly. "You're planning to kill Blackwell yourself." "It's not a question," but Eleanor answers anyway. "Cole Blackwell murdered my husband, Sheriff. He's killed dozens of others. He's planning to rob your town and disappear across the border. What would you have me do?" The lawman considers this, then nods slowly. There's justice, and then there's justice. Sometimes they look different. Indeed. Eleanor begins assembling her rifle with swift, practiced movements. Each component fits together with the precision of long familiarity, the weapon an extension of her own body. We should discuss contingencies. If Harrison has additional men we don't know about... She stops mid-sentence, her keen hearing detecting movement outside the abandoned office. Without a word, she motions Cooper to silence, moving with ghost-like stealth to a position beside the dust-covered window. Through a gap in the weathered boards, she spots a rider approaching cautiously, not from the direction of town, but from the eastern trail. The morning light isn't yet strong enough to identify the figure clearly, but something about the posture seems familiar. Eleanor signals Cooper to cover the rear exit, then positions her rifle through a narrow opening in the boards. As the rider draws closer, recognition dawns. "Samuel Washington," she murmurs, lowering her weapon slightly but maintaining vigilance. The horseman could be under duress, approaching unwillingly as a lure. Cooper relaxes marginally. Washington's solid. Known him for years. Eleanor remains cautious as Samuel dismounts, approaching the building with evident awareness that he might be walking into danger. "Mrs. Chambers," he calls softly. "Sheriff, it's Washington." Only when Scout's distinctive bark confirms the rider's identity does Eleanor fully lower her rifle. The blue tick hound wouldn't be fooled by coercion. His training was too thorough. She opens the door, admitting Samuel and Scout, who immediately presses against her leg in canine greeting. Samuel's expression is grave, his normally dignified bearing tense with urgency. "Telegraph came through at dawn," he reports without preamble. "Judge Harrison arrived at Pine Creek Station last night. He'll be in Copper Springs by noon today. A day earlier than expected." Cooper and Eleanor exchange alarmed glances. This accelerates their timeline considerably. "That's not all," Samuel continues. "2 men rode in with him. Military bearing, well-armed. They're claiming to be cattle buyers, but I recognize professional gunmen when I see them." "Blackwell's reinforcements," Eleanor concludes. "They've moved up their schedule." Cooper checks his pocket watch. "It's just past 6 now. If Harrison reaches town by noon, then the payroll shipment will likely arrive earlier as well." Eleanor finishes his thought. "They're compressing the timeline to reduce the chance of interference." She turns to Samuel, her decision made. "Mr. Washington, I need you to deliver a message to Ruth Miller. Tell her to implement our contingency immediately. All civilians clear Main Street by 11 o'clock. Samuel nods. "And the Anderson family? They were asking about Scout this morning." "Tell them whatever story maintains their safety," Eleanor replies. "The fewer people who know our intentions, the better." As Samuel prepares to depart, Eleanor retrieves a small package from her supplies. "One more thing," she says, handing it to him. "Deliver this to the telegraph office. It's addressed to the territorial governor in Santa Fe. If anything happens to Sheriff Cooper or myself today, this evidence must reach its destination." Samuel tucks the package securely inside. His coat. "It will, you have my word." After he leaves, Cooper turns to Eleanor, his expression reflecting the gravity of their situation. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and now we're short on time. Eleanor completes the assembly of her Sharps rifle, the weapon deadly and beautiful in its precision. "Numbers and conventional firepower are overrated, Sheriff," she replies, a cold confidence in her voice. "What matters is position, preparation, and the element of surprise." She loads a cartridge into the chamber with a definitive click. And trust me when I say, Cole Blackwell has no idea what's about to hit him. Copper Springs transforms from sleepy frontier town to battlefield in the span of minutes, though most residents remain oblivious to the invisible lines being drawn across their dusty main street. Eleanor watches from her elevated position as Judge Harrison ushers banker Hargrove toward the bank, the older man fumbling with a large ring of keys. Behind them, the cavalry sergeant maintains his position beside the payroll wagon, his men alert, despite the judge's obvious irritation at their continued presence. Sheriff Cooper emerges from the general store, casually making his way toward the military escort. His posture conveys relaxed authority, but Eleanor notes the subtle indicators of his readiness, the loosened revolver in its holster, his positioning that allows clear sightlines in multiple directions. Through her spyglass, Eleanor observes Cooper engaging the sergeant in conversation, their exchange appearing routine to casual observers. Yet she catches the moment when understanding registers in the military man's eyes, a slight stiffening of his posture, a subtle hand signal to his men that reinforces their vigilance rather than relaxing it. Margaret has taken position near the telegraph office, her unassuming appearance allowing her to blend with the morning shoppers while maintaining surveillance on Harrison's gunmen. One remains on the hotel balcony, watchful and ready. The second has disappeared inside the livery stable, presumably preparing the diversion that will draw attention from the main robbery. "Come on, Blackwell," Eleanor whispers, her eye never leaving the saloon where the outlaw leader and Carver remain conspicuously absent from the street. "Show yourself." As if summoned by her challenge, the saloon doors swing open. Cole Blackwell emerges, his scarred face tilted toward the morning sun with apparent casualness. He lights a cigarillo, leaning against a hitching post while surveying Main Street with calculated indifference. Only Eleanor's trained eye detects the subtle communication between him and Harrison, a brief nod, a tilt of the head indicating readiness. Carver follows moments later, crossing to the barber shop opposite the bank. His route appears random, but Eleanor recognizes how it positions him perfectly to cover the bank entrance once the robbery begins. She adjusts her rifle slightly, calculating distance and wind factors with automatic precision. The bank door opens under Hargrove's key. Harrison gestures impatiently, urging the banker inside while looking pointedly toward the cavalry escort. Eleanor's finger moves to her trigger guard, not yet taking a firing position, but prepared for the moment when pretense evaporates into violence. Samuel Washington appears at the edge of town, driving a wagon laden with barrels. This ordinary sight carries extraordinary significance. It's the signal that Ruth Miller has successfully implemented their contingency plan for civilians. The barrels contain emergency supplies being delivered to families on side streets, along with whispered warnings to remain indoors. Eleanor sweeps her spyglass across the scene once more, confirming positions and identifying the moment when deception will collapse into open conflict. Harrison has entered the bank behind Hargrove, leaving the door conspicuously unlocked despite banking hours not having officially begun. The cavalry sergeant has subtly repositioned his men, creating a more defensible formation while maintaining the appearance of routine guard duty. Movement from the direction of Pine Creek Road catches her attention, a single rider approaching at a measured pace. Even at this distance, something about the horseman's military bearing triggers Eleanor's instincts. The newcomer wears civilian clothes of exceptional quality, his silver hair and imperial beard suggesting age and authority. "Wilson," she murmurs, recognizing the secretary from newspaper engravings she'd seen during the war. The mastermind arrives to personally oversee the operation's conclusion, a critical tactical error born of arrogance. The livery stable erupts in flames precisely as Wilson reaches the edge of town. Thick black smoke billows skyward, accompanied by the panicked whinnying of horses. The timing is impeccable, creating maximum confusion without actually endangering the animals, who can be heard fleeing through the rear doors into the corral. "Diversion initiated," Eleanor notes clinically, her focus narrowing as the carefully orchestrated chaos unfolds. Citizens rush toward the fire, shouting and pointing. Two of the cavalry soldiers instinctively move to assist, but their sergeants' sharp command keeps them at their posts, Cooper's warning having its intended effect. Blackwell straightens from his lounging position, his hand dropping casually to his revolver as he begins strolling toward the bank. Carver emerges from the barber shop, mirroring his leader's movement from the opposite direction. On the hotel balcony, Harrison's gunman raises a rifle, sighting on the cavalry sergeant, the first intended casualty in what would become a massacre. Eleanor exhales slowly, squeezing the trigger with practiced precision. Her Sharp's rifle cracks, the sound momentarily lost amid the commotion surrounding the fire. The hotel balcony's wooden railing splinters inches from the gunman's position, sending him scrambling for cover, a deliberate warning shot that disrupts his aim without revealing her position. The effect is immediate. The carefully choreographed robbery transforms into confused scrambling as Blackwell and his accomplices realize an unknown sniper has entered their equation. The cavalry sergeant, veteran of a dozen Indian campaigns, recognizes the distinctive report of a Sharp's rifle and immediately orders his men to defensive positions. Sheriff Cooper seizes the moment of confusion, drawing his revolver and moving purposefully toward the bank, where Harrison remains inside with Hargrove. Wilson, caught in the open street as the situation deteriorates, spurs his horse toward the apparent safety of the hotel, directly into Margaret Hollister's line of sight. Eleanor's second shot splits the air, kicking up dust inches from Blackwell's boots as he attempts to reach the bank. The outlaw dives behind a water trough, his expression a mixture of fury and bewilderment as he scans rooftops for his unseen attacker. "Where is she?" he shouts to Carver, who has taken cover behind a freight wagon. "Find the shooter." Eleanor permits herself a cold smile at his choice of pronoun. Somehow, despite the confusion, Blackwell has recognized his true opponent. Perhaps Thomas had revealed her identity during their final confrontation, or perhaps Blackwell simply recognizes the precision that could only belong to Eagle Eye. The livery stable fire grows, genuine shouts of alarm replacing the orchestrated panic as flames spread more rapidly than Harrison's man had intended. The distraction has become a genuine emergency, dividing the town's attention between the growing conflagration and the armed standoff developing on Main Street. Eleanor shifts, her aim to the bank door as it opens, revealing Judge Harrison with a revolver pressed to banker Hargrove's head. The territorial judge has abandoned any pretense of legitimacy, his corpulent face flushed with rage and desperation as his carefully constructed plan disintegrates. "Hold your fire!" Harrison bellows toward the cavalry unit. "Or this man dies!" Cooper freezes mid-stride, caught in the open between the payroll wagon and the bank. His revolver remains drawn, but lowered, his expression calculating as he assesses this new development. "Judge Harrison," he calls steadily, "release Mr. Hargrove and surrender yourself. There's no way out of this now." Harrison's laugh carries a manic edge. "You simple fool. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Cooper. I have powerful friends who will see you buried in an unmarked grave if you interfere." Through her scope, Eleanor can see the judge's finger tightening on his trigger, not a bluff, but genuine intent to eliminate Hargrove as a witness. Her third shot cracks across the street, the bullet striking with surgical precision to remove a chunk of Harrison's hat brim without breaking his skin. The judge flinches violently, his aim disrupted long enough for Hargrove to wrench free, diving behind a hitching post. Harrison retreats into the bank, slamming the door. Through the window, Eleanor observes him moving toward the vault, presumably to secure the ledger Delgado had mentioned, the record of their conspiracy that could implicate officials at the highest levels. The confrontation has now fractured into multiple engagements across Main Street. Blackwell remains pinned behind the water trough, exchanging occasional fire with the cavalry unit. Carver attempts to work his way around to the rear of the bank, only to be driven back by Cooper's well-placed shots. Harrison's gunman from the livery stable has reappeared, taking position in an alley with clear lines of fire on the soldiers. Eleanor shifts her aim, calculating distance and wind for this new threat. Her fourth shot strikes the corner of the building inches from the gunman's head, showering him with splinters and forcing him back into cover. 4 shots fired, and not a single human target hit, yet each bullet has delivered a precise message. I could kill you if I chose to. Margaret. Hollister has disappeared from view, though Eleanor catches glimpses of her circling behind the hotel where Wilson has taken refuge. The secretary's security man, a hard-faced individual who had materialized from a nearby shop at the first sign of trouble, stands guard at the hotel entrance, scanning rooftops for the source of the precision fire. Time to change position, Eleanor murmurs, recognizing that continued fire from a single location will eventually reveal her presence. She withdraws from the steeple window, swiftly descending the narrow stairs with her rifle secured across her back. The church's rear exit allows her to slip unseen into the alleyway connecting to the assayer's office, a path that will bring her to a secondary firing position overlooking the bank's rear entrance. If Harrison attempts to flee with the ledger, she'll be perfectly positioned to intercept him. As she navigates the narrow passage, a shadow detaches itself from a recessed doorway ahead. Carver, who has circled behind the main confrontation, seeking the sniper who's disrupted their plans. His eyes widen in recognition and confusion as he identifies not a rival gunman, but the quiet widow from Cottonwood Creek. "You?" he exclaims, genuine bewilderment crossing his face before hardening into determination. His hand drops to his revolver, but Eleanor is already moving. 3 years of peaceful existence haven't dulled the combat reflexes honed through wartime operations. Eleanor's rifle remains secured across her back as she closes distance with startling speed, entering Carver's firing arc before he can fully draw his weapon. Her left hand strikes his wrist with precise force, numbing the nerves and disrupting his grip. Simultaneously, her right hand produces the Navy Colt from her belt holster, its barrel pressing under Carver's chin before he can't process what's happening. The outlaw freezes, genuine fear replacing his earlier confidence as he confronts skills no simple widow should possess. "Hello, Mr. Carver." Eleanor greets him with the same quiet voice she'd used while selling him leather goods weeks earlier. "I believe we have unfinished business." "What the hell are you?" Carver manages, his Adam's apple bobbing against the revolver's cold barrel. "I'm the widow you and Blackwell have been mocking," she replies evenly. "I'm also the last person Thomas Chambers saw before your boss put a bullet in his back." Recognition dawns in Carver's eyes. "You're her, the ghost, the one they called Eagle Eye." "Indeed." Eleanor's expression remains impassive. "Now you're going to tell me exactly where Secretary Wilson plans to rendezvous with Harrison after the robbery." "I don't know what you're talking about," Carver attempts, his bravado undermined by the tremor in his voice. Eleanor sighs, then strikes with calculated precision. the revolver butt connecting with Carver's temple just hard enough to daze without rendering him unconscious. As he sags against the wall, she presses her advantage. "That was discourteous, Mr. Carver. Let's try honesty instead. Where is Wilson meeting Harrison?" Blood trickles from Carver's hairline as he blinks away stars. "Pine Creek Station," he gasps. "After the gold is secured, they're taking the military codes and the ledger east on the evening train." "What military codes?" Eleanor demands, though she suspects the answer. "Hidden in the payroll shipment," Carver reveals. "New encryption protocols for all Western territories, worth more than the gold to the right foreign buyers." This new information clarifies the conspiracy's true scope, not mere robbery, but treason, on a scale that could compromise national security for years to come. Eleanor processes the implications swiftly, adjusting her strategy accordingly. "One more question, Mr. Carver. How many men does Wilson have positioned in town?" Carver's hesitation earns him another precise strike, this time to a nerve cluster in his shoulder that sends lightning pain down his arm. "4," he gasps, "besides his personal guard. 2 in the hotel, 2 covering the East Road." Eleanor nods, satisfied with his cooperation. "Thank you for your honesty." Before Carver can respond, she strikes again, this time with calculated force that renders him unconscious. After securing him with his own belt and neckerchief, she drags his inert form deeper into the shadowed doorway where he'll remain hidden until the confrontation concludes. Gunfire erupts from Main Street, sporadic but intensifying. The cavalry. Sergeant's disciplined voice carries commands to his men, while Blackwell's distinctive bellow responds with profanity-laden defiance. The confrontation is escalating toward its inevitable conclusion. Eleanor resumes her path toward her secondary position, processing Carver's information and recalculating her approach. Wilson's additional men represent an unknown variable that could endanger Cooper and the cavalrymen. Margaret likely suspects their presence, but lacks the combat training to neutralize multiple opponents. Reaching the assayer's office, Eleanor slips inside through the unlocked back door. The business stands empty, its proprietor having heeded Samuel Washington's warning to evacuate. She moves swiftly to the front room, positioning herself beside a window that offers clear sightlines to both the bank's rear entrance and portions of Main Street. Through the glass, she observes the evolving tactical situation. Cooper has taken cover behind a freight wagon, exchanging occasional fire with Blackwell, who remains pinned behind the water trough. The cavalry unit has established a defensive perimeter around the payroll wagon, their repeating rifles keeping Harrison's remaining gunmen contained in the alley beside the apothecary. The bank remains ominously quiet, its doors secured from within. Harrison is surely gathering the ledger and preparing for escape, likely through the rear entrance that will bring him directly into Eleanor's line of fire. Fresh shouts draw her attention to the livery stable where the fire has grown. Truly dangerous. Despite the tactical situation, Cooper signals 2 cavalrymen to assist the bucket brigade forming to combat the flames. His decision reflects the sheriff's fundamental commitment to the town's safety above all else, a quality Eleanor respects, even as she recognizes the tactical compromise it represents. Movement at the hotel catches her eye. Wilson's security man conferring with 2 newcomers whose military bearing confirms Carver's information about additional agents. Their gestures suggest they're planning to circle behind the cavalry unit, creating a crossfire that would devastate the soldiers' defensive position. Eleanor adjusts her rifle, calculating ranges for this expanded battlefield. The single advantage, she maintains, is that none of her opponents know her exact position or capabilities. Blackwell has surely guessed her identity by now, but Wilson's men still anticipate a conventional firefight rather than precision elimination from unexpected angles. A flash of color in her peripheral vision alerts Eleanor to Margaret Hollister's position. The older woman has worked her way behind the hotel and now signals from a partially concealed location near the bathhouse. Her gestures, utilizing the specialized hand codes they developed during wartime intelligence operations, convey critical information. Wilson preparing escape. East Road, 2 horses. Eleanor acknowledges with an equally subtle signal, then refocuses on the tactical situation. Wilson's attempted escape would bring him directly past her current position, an opportunity to capture the conspiracy's mastermind that she cannot squander. The rear door of the bank opens cautiously, revealing Judge Harrison's corpulent figure. The territorial judge peers cautiously in both directions before emerging fully, a leather satchel clutched protectively against his chest, undoubtedly containing the ledger and other evidence of the conspiracy. Harrison moves with surprising stealth for a man of his bulk, using outbuildings and rain barrels for cover as he works his way toward the hotel. His route will intersect with Wilson's planned escape path, the final pieces falling into place for their extraction. Eleanor allows him to proceed, recognizing that Harrison will lead her directly to Wilson. Through her scope, she can see sweat beading on the judge's forehead, his complexion flushed with exertion and fear as gunfire continues to punctuate the confrontation on Main Street. A new voice rises above the chaos, Sheriff Cooper calling for Blackwell's surrender. "It's over, Blackwell. Your men are down. Harrison's cornered. Throw out your weapon and stand up with your hands visible." Eleanor shifts her attention momentarily to Main Street, where the tactical situation has indeed shifted. The cavalrymen have worked methodically to neutralize Harrison's gunmen in the alley, leaving Blackwell isolated behind the increasingly damaged water trough. Bullets have splintered the wooden structure, water pouring onto the dusty street from multiple ruptures. Blackwell's response is predictably defiant. "Go to hell, Cooper. I've killed better men than you." "Perhaps," Cooper acknowledges calmly. "But you haven't faced Eagle Eye before." The name sends a visible shock through Blackwell's posture. He peers around his deteriorating cover, scanning rooftops and windows with new intensity, seeking the legendary sharpshooter he now realizes has been targeting him since the confrontation began. Eleanor permits herself a grim smile before returning her attention to Harrison, who has nearly reached the hotel's rear entrance. As anticipated, Wilson's security man appears, gesturing urgently for the judge to hurry. Behind him, Eleanor catches a glimpse of the secretary himself, mounted on a fresh horse with a second animal prepared for Harrison's escape. The moment has arrived. Eleanor steadies her breathing, sighting on the narrow space between Harrison and the security man. Her fifth shot of the day strikes with surgical precision, splitting the air between the two men and embedding itself in the wooden doorframe. Both men freeze, Harrison's face draining of color as he realizes the shooter has anticipated his escape route. The security man recovers more quickly, drawing a revolver and firing repeatedly toward the assayer's office window. Inaccurate shots born of panic rather than skill. Eleanor has already shifted position, moving to another window that provides a different angle on the increasingly desperate conspirators. Wilson has spurred his horse into motion, apparently willing to abandon Harrison rather than risk capture. The judge stands paralyzed between his former ally's betrayal and the unseen sniper's deadly accuracy. "Judge Harrison," Eleanor calls clearly, her voice carrying in the momentary lull between gunfire on Main Street. "Drop the satchel and raise your hands. You're surrounded." Harrison's head whips toward her voice, recognition and disbelief warring across his features as he identifies the quiet widow from the small leather shop. A woman he'd dismissed as inconsequential, now revealed as his nemesis. "You," he breathes, the single word carrying years of miscalculation. "Me," Eleanor confirms, her rifle trained steadily on his substantial form. Thomas Chambers sends his regards. Judge Harrison's composure shatters as he realizes the extent of his miscalculation. The leather satchel slips from his grasp, landing in the dust as his hands rise tremulously. Behind him, Wilson's security man assesses the situation with cold professionalism, calculating angles and risks as he shields his employer's retreat. "Lower your weapon," the security man demands, his own revolver shifting between potential hiding places, uncertain of Eleanor's exact position. "You're interfering with a federal operation." "Federal treason," Eleanor corrects, maintaining her cover while adjusting her aim to track Wilson, who has nearly reached the corner of the hotel. Secretary Wilson is not leaving Copper Springs with those encryption codes. The security man's expression flickers, surprised that she knows Wilson's identity, followed by renewed determination. Last warning: stand down or be considered an enemy of the United States government. Eleanor's response comes in the form of a precise shot that severs Wilson's horse's reins, causing the animal to rear in panic. The secretary, a political appointee with minimal riding experience, tumbles unceremoniously to the ground, his dignity suffering more damage than his person as he lands in a patch of muddy water. The security man opens fire immediately, bullets splintering the assayer's office window and forcing Eleanor to duck momentarily. She relocates swiftly, utilizing the building's internal layout to emerge at a different vantage point, while the gunman's attention remains fixed on her previous position. Judge Harrison, seizing what he perceives as an opportunity, scrambles for the fallen satchel. Before his fingers can close around the leather handle, Margaret Hollister emerges from her concealed position, her small-caliber revolver aimed with unwavering precision at the judge's expansive midsection. "I wouldn't, Edgar," she says, using the judge's first name with the familiarity of an old acquaintance. "Not unless you wish to explain to your maker why you arranged my husband's murder." Harrison freezes, recognition transforming his fear to horror. "Margaret, but you're dead?" she supplies. "Like Edward? Like Major Chambers? Your conspiracy has a habit of announcing premature obituaries." From her new position, Eleanor has a clear shot at Wilson's security man, who now stands exposed as he attempts to assist the fallen secretary. She could end his threat permanently with a single bullet, but such finality would eliminate potential testimony. Instead, she adjusts her aim and fires, the bullet passing through the man's outer thigh with surgical precision, damaging muscle. But avoiding arteries, the security man collapses with a strangled cry, his weapon skittering across the dirt. Wilson, abandoned by his protection and confronted by enemies he'd believed eliminated years ago, reveals his true character, not the dignified statesman of his public persona, but a cornered rat willing to sacrifice anyone for survival. "Harrison!" he shouts, his aristocratic facade crumbling. "Deal with this, that's an order!" The judge remains paralyzed between Margaret's unwavering aim and Eleanor's unseen but palpable presence. The satchel lies between them, its contents potentially sufficient to unravel a conspiracy reaching to Washington's highest circles. On Main Street, the confrontation between Blackwell and the lawmen reaches its climax. The outlaw, recognizing his deteriorating position, makes a desperate bid for escape, emerging from cover in a crouching run toward the nearest alley. Cooper's revolver barks twice, the bullet striking dirt at Blackwell's heels as the sheriff attempts to drive him toward the cavalryman's position. Blackwell responds with wildfire, his bullets dangerously close to bystanders still battling the livery stable blaze. This reckless disregard for innocent lives forces Eleanor to make a swift decision. Her next shot strikes Blackwell's revolver with preternatural accuracy, the impact numbing his hand and sending the weapon spinning into the dust. The outlaw's momentum carries him into the open, suddenly disarmed and vulnerable. The cavalry sergeant, recognizing the opportunity, shouts commands to his men. They advance methodically, carbines trained on Blackwell's now frozen figure. "On your knees, hands behind your head." Cooper orders, emerging from cover with his revolver aimed steadily. For a moment it appears Blackwell might comply, his arrogance giving way to tactical reality. Then his eyes shift to the hotel corner where Wilson and Harrison stand exposed. And calculation replaces defeat. These men represent the conspiracy's pinnacle, witnesses whose testimony could implicate him in crimes far beyond simple robbery and murder. "Wilson!" he bellows, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "The ledger! Destroy it!" The secretary's head snaps up, his eyes widening at this public identification. With surprising agility for a man of his years and sedentary profession, Wilson lunges for the satchel, colliding with Harrison in a desperate scramble to secure the damning evidence. Margaret maintains her aim, but hesitates to fire, conscious of the larger goal of preserving testimony rather than exacting immediate vengeance. This momentary restraint proves costly as Harrison's substantial bulk knocks her aside, her small revolver discharging harmlessly into the air. Eleanor shifts position again, seeking a clear shot that would incapacitate without killing. The confusing tangle of Wilson and Harrison, rolling in the dust as they fight for possession of the satchel, presents no clean target. She must change strategies immediately. Abandoning her concealed position, Eleanor emerges onto the boardwalk, her Sharps rifle held at ready but no longer employed for distant shooting. The suddenness of her appearance, the transformation of the quiet widow into an armed combatant, momentarily freezes the struggle between Wilson and Harrison. "Secretary Wilson!" She addresses him formally, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Your conspiracy is exposed. Surrender the ledger, and perhaps you'll face a military tribunal rather than a hangman's noose." Wilson recovers quickly, his politician's instinct for self-preservation overwhelming momentary shock. "Nonsense," he blusters, rising to his feet with the satchel clutched protectively. "This woman is clearly deranged. I'm here on official government business, investigating potential misappropriation of military resources." "Is that what you call selling military encryption codes to foreign governments?" Eleanor counters, advancing steadily. "Or arranging the murders of loyal American soldiers who discovered your treason?" Harrison, sensing the tide turning irrevocably against them, makes a desperate move, producing a derringer from his sleeve and aiming not at Eleanor but at Wilson. "She's right," he says, his voice trembling with equal parts fear and determination. "And I won't hang alone for this. The political calculating machine that is Secretary Wilson assesses this new threat with cold precision." "Edgar," he says soothingly, "consider your position. It's her word against ours. A widow shopkeeper against a territorial judge and a cabinet secretary. Who do you imagine people will believe?" "They'll believe this," Margaret interjects, retrieving her dropped revolver and producing a folded document from within her bodice. "Edward's final report, identifying you as the source of leaked military intelligence during the war. The report you thought was destroyed when you arranged his murder." Wilson's facade cracks further, genuine alarm replacing calculated confidence. "Impossible. All copies were eliminated." "Not all," Eleanor confirms, continuing her measured approach. "Thomas Chambers preserved his portion, as did others in General Hollister's network. Main Street has gone eerily quiet, the confrontation between Blackwell and the lawman temporarily forgotten as this new drama unfolds. Cooper, ever vigilant, maintains his aim on the outlaw while listening intently to the exchange that reveals the true scope of the conspiracy. Wilson makes a final, desperate assessment of his deteriorating position. The satchel contains evidence that would destroy him utterly, not just his career, but his very life forfeit to treason charges. With surprising swiftness, he pivots and runs toward the rear of the hotel, clutching the damning evidence to his chest. Harrison's derringer discharges with a sharp crack, the bullet catching Wilson in the shoulder but failing to stop his flight. The secretary staggers but maintains his forward momentum, disappearing around the corner with the territorial judge in stumbling pursuit. Eleanor signals Margaret with a quick hand gesture, a battlefield communication developed during their wartime collaboration. The older woman nods, understanding, circling wide to cut off potential escape routes, while Eleanor follows directly. As she rounds the corner, Eleanor confronts a scene of brutal clarity. Wilson has reached his fallen security man, retrieving the guard's revolver with desperate intensity. Harrison lumbers after him, derringer spent but determination undiminished. "Stop!" Eleanor commands, her sharps aimed with unwavering precision. "That's far enough, Mr. Secretary." Wilson whirls, the retrieved revolver rising toward her with trembling determination. Eleanor could eliminate the threat instantly, a single shot at this range, guaranteed to find its mark. Yet she hesitates, recognizing the importance of capturing him alive to expose the full conspiracy. This momentary restraint allows Margaret to complete her flanking maneuver, emerging from between buildings with her revolver leveled at Wilson's. "Back. Your move, Jonathan," she says, using the secretary's first name with cold familiarity. "Though I recommend considering that Eagle Eye earned her name by hitting targets at 800 yards. At 20 feet, she could put a bullet through your eye before you could tighten your finger on that trigger." Wilson's calculation is visible in his expression, weighing odds, considering options, seeking advantage even as his position deteriorates beyond salvation. For a terrible moment, Eleanor believes he will force her hand, requiring the very violence she hopes to avoid. Instead, a new voice breaks the tension. "Drop it, Wilson," Cooper orders, appearing from the street with his revolver trained steadily on the secretary. "Your men are neutralized. Blackwell's in custody. There's nowhere left to run." The fight visibly drains from Wilson's posture, his shoulders slumping as the revolver lowers incrementally. In this moment of apparent surrender, Harrison makes his final fatal error, lunging for the satchel still clutched in Wilson's left arm. The secretary reacts instinctively, the revolver discharging at point-blank range into the judge's substantial form. Harrison crumples with a shocked expression, his life's blood spreading across the dust as Wilson stares in horror at this unintended consequence of his desperation. Before he can recover, Margaret closes the distance, her smaller revolver pressed directly against his temple. "For Edward," she says simply, her finger tightening on the trigger with clear intent. "Margaret, no!" Eleanor intercedes, her voice sharp with command. "Not like this. He faces justice properly, publicly, exposing everyone involved." A terrible struggle plays across Margaret Hollister's features, vengeance warring with principle, personal grief against larger justice. For 3 agonizing heartbeats, Eleanor believes her former associate will choose retribution over legal process. Then, with visible effort, Margaret lowers her weapon. For Thomas, then, she concedes, he believed in the law, even when it failed him. Cooper moves forward, securing Wilson with practiced efficiency. The secretary offers no resistance, his aristocratic demeanor utterly collapsed beneath the weight of his exposed crimes. The satchel, prize of so much bloodshed, tumbles forgotten from his grasp. Eleanor retrieves it carefully, opening the leather flap to confirm its contents. Inside lies not just the ledger Delgado had mentioned, but multiple codebooks, correspondence, bearing governmental seals, and a list of names that sends a chill through her professional assessment. Foreign agents, co-conspirators within the American government, military officers susceptible to bribery. This goes beyond Wilson, she notes, showing Cooper a particularly damning document. There are at least 3 senators implicated here, military commanders, foreign diplomats. The sheriff's expression grows grim as he processes the implications. "We'll need federal marshals, proper authorities to handle this level of..." Gunfire erupts from Main Street, interrupting Cooper mid-sentence. Eleanor's instincts surge to immediate readiness, her rifle shifting toward potential threat even as she calculates tactical possibilities. Cooper secures Wilson with swift efficiency, then proceeds cautiously toward the street, Eleanor following with Margaret covering their rear. The scene they discover defies immediate comprehension. The cavalry unit stands in defensive formation, rifles trained on a new threat emerging from the hotel, 3 well-dressed men with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents, badges displayed prominently on their coats. U.S. Marshals, their leader announces, his voice carrying official authority. Lower your weapons and surrender the prisoner Wilson immediately. Cooper hesitates, his lawman's instinct for respecting federal authority warring with recent revelations. On whose authority? He demands, maintaining his position. Senator Collins, the lead marshal, responds, by direct order of the president himself. This is a matter of national security. Eleanor processes this development with cold clarity. Collins, a name appearing prominently in Wilson's documentation as a key conspirator. These aren't legitimate marshals, but another layer of the conspiracy, sent to eliminate evidence and witnesses. They're not marshals, she says quietly too. Cooper, the badges are genuine, but they're part of Wilson's network. The sheriff nods almost imperceptibly, his decision made. I need to see written orders, he calls, deliberately stalling while signaling the cavalry sergeant with subtle hand movements. The lead marshal advances, one hand extending with apparent documentation, while the other remains suspiciously close to his holstered weapon. Right here, Sheriff. Everything is in order, as you'll see. Cooper steps forward as if to examine the papers, creating a momentary distraction that allows Eleanor to slip aside, seeking an advantageous position. The false marshal's attention remains fixed on the sheriff and their quarry, Wilson, who has begun to display renewed confidence at his colleague's arrival. It seems the situation has changed, Sheriff, the secretary remarks, his aristocratic demeanor reasserting itself. I suggest you release me to these gentlemen immediately. The cavalry sergeant, a veteran of numerous Indian campaigns, recognizes the tactical situation with practiced assessment. He signals his men to maintain their positions, carbines unwavering despite the apparent federal authority confronting them. Eleanor reaches her chosen vantage point, a narrow space between buildings, offering clear sightlines while providing adequate cover. Through her rifle's sight, she studies the false marshals with professional evaluation, identifying their likely combat capabilities and prioritizing targets should violence prove unavoidable. The lead imposter has nearly reached Cooper, his documentation extended in one hand while the other edges closer to his revolver. Eleanor recognizes the imminent threat. These men will eliminate the sheriff first, then the witnesses, retrieving both Wilson and the damning evidence before disappearing into carefully constructed alibis and official protection. Her next decision carries moral weight she hasn't confronted since the war. These men represent American law enforcement, corrupted though they may be. Killing them crosses a boundary between combat and murder, yet allowing their deception to succeed ensures the conspiracy continues unchecked. The leader's hand drops to his holster, his intention becoming unmistakable as Cooper reaches for the offered documentation. Eleanor exhales slowly, her finger tightening on the trigger with calculated precision. Her shot splits the air with authority, striking not the man himself, but the badge pinned to his coat, a symbolic statement that carries unmistakable meaning. The false marshal freezes, genuine shock replacing his practiced confidence, as he stares at the damaged metal now hanging askew from his lapel. The next one goes through your heart, Eleanor calls clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. Unless you prefer to explain to a judge how United States Marshals are taking orders from a senator implicated in treason. The false marshal's companions exchange uncertain glances, their hands hovering near weapons, but not quite drawing, calculating odds against an unseen sharpshooter whose first shot demonstrated lethal capability, exercised with deliberate restraint. Cooper seizes the moment of hesitation, his revolver rising to cover the leader directly. "On the ground, hands where I can see them," he orders, all pretense of compliance abandoned. "You're under arrest for impersonating federal officers and conspiracy to obstruct justice." For a heartbeat, violence hangs in the balance. 3 armed men weighing desperation against survival, the corruption of their allegiance against the value of their lives. Eleanor maintains her aim, prepared to eliminate the central threat if necessary, while calculating trajectories for his companions. The leader makes his choice, eyes darting to locations where his co-conspirators might take effective cover if shooting begins. Eleanor's second shot removes this option definitively, the bullet striking the dirt precisely between his feet, a final warning impossible to misinterpret. "Don't," she advises simply. Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the professional dispassion that accompanies perfect capability, breaks their resistance. Weapons lower gradually, then drop to the ground as hands rise in surrender. As the cavalry unit moves to secure these new prisoners, Margaret approaches Wilson, whose renewed confidence has collapsed once more into desperation. "You recognize the voice, don't you, Jonathan?" she asks quietly. "You should. Her shots killed 17 Confederate officers you'd arranged to protect in exchange for gold. Edward knew even then. He kept records of your communications, records I've preserved all these years." Wilson's complexion turns ashen as the full implications register. "You can't prove anything," he attempts, though the words sound hollow even to his own ears. Margaret smiles thinly. "With your ledger, the general's records, and Major Chambers' evidence, the military tribunal will have everything they need." She leans closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant for his ears alone. "And I'll be there. Jonathan, I'll watch them put the hood over your head." As the false marshals are secured alongside their conspirators, Cooper approaches Eleanor, who has emerged from her position now that immediate threats are neutralized. The sheriff studies her with newfound understanding, seeing not the quiet widow who crafted leather goods, but the legendary sharpshooter whose skills had turned the tide of crucial battles. "Mrs. Chambers," he acknowledges, the formal address a concession to maintaining her cover despite revelations. "It seems I owe you more than thanks for that gun belt." Eleanor allows herself a small smile. "Consider it a professional courtesy." "Between peace officers, Sheriff." Her gaze shifts to the secured prisoners, Wilson, the false marshals, and finally Blackwell, whose scarred face reveals calculation even in defeat. "Though our work isn't finished yet." Cooper nods understanding. "The list of names in that ledger, conspirators across multiple territories, possibly reaching to Washington itself." "Precisely. This isn't just about a payroll robbery or even Thomas's murder anymore." Eleanor's expression hardens as she contemplates the broader implications. Wilson's conspiracy represents corruption that could undermine the very foundations of our government. Exposing it fully will require resources beyond Copper Springs. The sheriff considers this, then reaches a decision. The territorial governor is due in Santa Fe next week. With your evidence and testimony, we could present the case directly, bypassing potential conspirators in the justice system. A journey with considerable risks, Eleanor notes. Wilson's associates will move quickly once they realize he's been captured. There will be additional attempts to silence witnesses and destroy evidence. Cooper's expression suggests he's already considered these dangers. Then, it's fortunate we have the territory's deadliest sharpshooter to ensure the truth reaches its destination. Eleanor studies Blackwell one final time, the man who murdered her husband, who believed her nothing more than a grieving widow to be mocked and threatened. His eyes meet hers across the dusty street, recognition and something approaching respect, visible in his gaze despite his defeat. "Justice has been delayed 3 years," she says quietly. "It can wait another week to be done properly." As townsfolk begin cautiously emerging to assess the aftermath of violence in their midst, Eleanor makes a swift decision. Her identity has been compromised, her carefully constructed life as a simple widow shattered beyond repair. Yet the skills that made her legendary during the war have proven their enduring value, not for dealing death this time, but for exposing corruption that threatens the nation's future. "First," she tells Cooper, securing her rifle with practiced efficiency, "we need to rescue Delgado from where I left him on the Pine Creek Trail. His testimony regarding Harrison's operations will be crucial to building the larger case." The sheriff blinks in surprise. "Delgado's alive?" Bound and likely extremely uncomfortable, but yes, Eleanor permits herself another small smile. "Contrary to what these gentlemen believed, I don't kill when justice can be better served through testimony." As the cavalry unit organizes transportation for their prisoners, Eleanor catches Margaret's eye across the street. The older woman nods once, acknowledgement of completion, of promises kept and vengeance channeled into proper justice. 3 years of patience, preparation, and precise calculation have culminated in this moment of revelation. Eagle Eye has emerged from the shadows, and the conspiracy that believed itself untouchable has discovered too late the deadly accuracy of her aim. 6 months after the gunfire in Copper Springs faded into memory, Eleanor Chambers stands on the platform of a Santa Fe railway station, watching as U.S. Marshals, genuine ones this time, escort Secretary Wilson toward a heavily guarded prison car. The once powerful man's shoulders slump beneath the weight of his chains, his aristocratic bearing diminished by months of confinement awaiting trial. Wilson's gaze finds Eleanor in the crowd. Recognition flickers across his features, followed by a complex mixture of hatred and reluctant respect. She meets his eyes steadily, offering neither satisfaction nor sympathy, merely the implacable witness to justice, long delayed but finally delivered. As the train pulls away, Margaret Hollister joins Eleanor on the platform, both women dressed in the practical traveling clothes that have become their standard attire during the past months of testimony, depositions, and court appearances. 3 senators, a cabinet secretary, 2 generals, and a dozen lesser officials. Margaret notes, watching the train disappear around a bend. Edward would be pleased with the thoroughness of the house cleaning. Thomas, too, Eleanor agrees quietly, though I doubt either of them anticipated the cost. The cost has indeed been substantial, not merely in lives lost during the conspiracy's operation, but in the national trauma of exposing corruption at the government's highest levels. The trial transcripts detailing Wilson's decades-long operation, selling military secrets, have dominated newspaper headlines for months, shaking public confidence in institutions once considered beyond reproach. Yet from this painful reckoning has come renewed commitment to oversight and accountability, reforms that both women have helped shape through their testimony and evidence preservation. "Your train leaves in an hour," Margaret observes, consulting a silver pocket watch that had once belonged to her husband. "Are you certain about this decision?" Eleanor nods, her resolve evident in the set of her shoulders. Copper Springs was never truly home, just a way station where I buried myself in grief. It's time for something new. The past 6 months have transformed Eleanor in ways beyond mere appearance. Gone is the quiet widow crafting leather goods in isolation. In her place stands a woman who has reclaimed her full capabilities, her testimony, helping to dismantle a conspiracy that threatened national security, while demonstrating skills that impressed even veteran lawmen. Those same skills have now earned her an unexpected opportunity, one presented by the territorial governor himself. Following Wilson's conviction, "The Arizona Rangers will be fortunate to have you," Margaret acknowledges. "Though I imagine some of the men may struggle with a female sharpshooter among their ranks." Eleanor's smile carries subtle confidence. "They'll adjust. The governor was quite clear. My abilities, not my gender, determined the appointment." The newly formed Arizona Rangers represent the territory's response to increasingly sophisticated criminal operations crossing multiple jurisdictions. Eleanor's unique combination of combat experience, tactical assessment, and unparalleled marksmanship made her an unconventional but compelling candidate, despite prevailing attitudes about women in law enforcement. "And Cole Blackwell?" Margaret asks, though she knows the answer. "Hanged 3 weeks ago in Yuma prison," Eleanor confirms, her expression revealing neither satisfaction nor regret, merely acknowledgement of justice served. "He maintained his arrogance until the end, though he did finally admit to Thomas's murder." The railway station bustles around them, passengers and porters navigating the platform with the energetic purpose of a territory in transformation. Arizona in 1879 stands at the cusp of profound change. Railroads, telegraph lines, and growing settlements gradually taming what was once a wild frontier. "I received a letter from Samuel Washington yesterday," Eleanor continues, retrieving the correspondence from her traveling bag. "Scout has apparently appointed himself guardian of Samuel's grandchildren. They've named the newest foal at his ranch Eagle in my honor." Margaret smiles at this connection to their shared past, the code name that had become legend during the war, now transformed into a child's innocent tribute. "And Ruth Miller? Will she continue your leather business?" "She's already expanded it," Eleanor confirms with evident approval, "hired 2 apprentices and secured a contract supplying saddles to the cavalry at Fort Whipple. The oak leaf design has become quite fashionable among officers." Their conversation pauses as a porter announces the imminent departure of the eastbound train, Margaret's transportation to Washington, where she will continue working with the War Department to implement security reforms, preventing future intelligence compromises. The women's paths, so unexpectedly reunited in Copper Springs, now diverge toward different horizons. "I've been thinking about what Thomas would make of all this," Eleanor admits, an unusual moment of vulnerability from a woman whose self-control has become legendary. "Whether he would approve of my choices." Margaret considers this thoughtfully. "Thomas married Eagle Eye knowing exactly who she was," she replies after a moment. "He never expected you to diminish yourself, only to find peace in whatever form suited you best." "And have I?" Eleanor wonders aloud. "Found peace? I think," Margaret says with gentle perception, "you've found purpose, which for women like us often amounts to the same thing." A porter approaches, informing Margaret that her luggage has been loaded and the train awaits. The women regard each other with the shared understanding of survivors who have witnessed both humanity's darkest capabilities and its capacity for justice. "You'll write?" Margaret requests, though it sounds more like an instruction. "When circumstances permit," Eleanor agrees, knowing her new role with the Rangers will often take her to remote locations for extended periods. "And you'll continue your work with the War Department?" "Someone must ensure Wilson's networks are truly dismantled," Margaret confirms. "Edward's work remains unfinished." They embrace briefly, an uncharacteristic display from women trained to contain emotion, before Margaret boards her eastbound train. Eleanor remains on the platform until the train disappears, carrying the last direct connection to her former life toward new purpose in Washington. With an hour remaining before her own departure westward, Eleanor makes her way to a small cemetery. On Santa Fe's outskirts, The simple military headstone bears Thomas's name, rank, and dates, recently relocated from its former unmarked location near Cottonwood Creek to receive proper honors following Wilson's conviction. Eleanor kneels beside the grave, removing her gloves to trace the engraved letters with bare fingers. "It's done, Thomas," she says quietly. "Every name in your evidence has faced justice. Every part of Wilson's operation was exposed." A warm breeze stirs the juniper trees surrounding the cemetery, their subtle fragrance evoking memories of the modest homestead where she had retreated to mourn him. That chapter has ended now, the property sold to the Anderson family, who had always admired its strategic positioning and well-maintained improvements. "I've accepted a position with the Arizona Rangers," she continues, speaking to her husband's memory with the simple directness that characterized their relationship in life. Governor Fremont was quite insistent after the Wilson trial concluded. "Said they needed someone with my particular capabilities." From her pocket, Eleanor removes two objects: Thomas's wedding ring, which she has carried since his death, and the small brass compass he gave her on their first anniversary. She places both atop the headstone, visible testament to a journey completed. "I won't be returning to this grave," she explains to the silent stone. "Not because I'm forgetting, but because you're coming with me in ways that matter more than geography." Rising, Eleanor brushes dust from her traveling skirt, practical garments designed for her new role, combining feminine propriety with the freedom of movement her duties will require. The Sharp's rifle case rests against a nearby tree, never far from reach, despite the peaceful surroundings. "Sheriff Cooper asked me to convey his respects," she adds. "He's considering running for territorial legislature next year," says someone. "Needs to represent rural communities in Phoenix." William Cooper's political aspirations represent another unexpected outcome of the Wilson conspiracy's exposure. The sheriff's steadfast commitment to justice, despite overwhelming odds, had captured public attention, transforming the previously unremarkable lawman into a symbol of frontier integrity. A church bell tolls the half-hour, reminding Eleanor of her impending departure. She rests her hand briefly atop the headstone in final farewell. "We did well, Thomas," she concludes simply. "Rest easy now." The walk back to the railway station takes Eleanor through Santa Fe's Central Plaza, where newspaper boys shout the latest headlines concerning Wilson's transportation to federal prison. Several citizens nod respectful greetings as she passes, recognizing her from the extensively covered trial proceedings. Eleanor acknowledges these greetings with composed dignity, neither seeking recognition nor avoiding it. A subtle but profound shift from the widow who once shunned attention in Copper Springs. Experience has taught her that true concealment lies not in hiding, but in strategic visibility, controlled narratives that direct attention precisely where she chooses. At the station, she retrieves her ticket for Prescott, where the Arizona Rangers headquarters awaits her arrival. The conductor examines her documentation with professional courtesy, though his eyes widen slightly upon noting the unusual addendum authorizing transportation of specialized firearms. "Military issue, ma'am?" he inquires with polite curiosity. "Official equipment," Eleanor responds simply, offering no elaboration as she boards the westbound train. Her assigned compartment proves satisfactory, private accommodations arranged by the territorial government for their newest ranger. Eleanor secures her rifle case beneath the seat before settling beside the window, observing the station platform's bustling activity as departure time approaches. A knock at her compartment door interrupts her contemplation. Upon opening it, she discovers a young cavalry lieutenant, his uniform indicating assignment to Fort Whipple near her Prescott destination. "Mrs. Chambers?" he inquired, maintaining formal military bearing. "Lieutenant Nathaniel Parker, ma'am. Governor Fremont asked me to provide escort for the remainder of your journey to Ranger headquarters." Eleanor assesses the young officer with practiced efficiency, early 30s, campaign ribbons, suggesting experience in the recent Apache conflicts, intelligent eyes that meet her gaze directly without challenge or condescension. More importantly, his stance and positioning demonstrate genuine respect rather than the grudging accommodation she's encountered from other military men upon learning of her appointment. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she acknowledges, gesturing to the opposite seat. "Though I should mention, I no longer use Mrs. Chambers professionally. My Ranger commission was issued under my maiden name, Winters." "Of course, Miss Winters." Parker corrects himself smoothly. "The governor briefed me on your background. It's an honor to meet the woman they called Eagle Eye." Eleanor studies him with renewed interest, noting the absence of disbelief or skepticism that typically accompanies such recognition. "You seem remarkably comfortable with a female sharpshooter, Lieutenant." Parker's expression shifts, revealing unexpected personal connections. "My older sister served as a field nurse during the war, ma'am. Saved more lives than most fighting men. Taught me early that capability doesn't follow conventional assumptions about gender." As the train lurches into motion, beginning its journey westward, Eleanor permits herself a small smile of appreciation. Perhaps the new Arizona Rangers will prove more adaptable than anticipated. "The Rangers have established operations in 4 territory sections," Parker explains, unfolding a detailed map across the compartment's small table. "Your initial assignment covers the northwest quadrant, primarily mining communities experiencing sophisticated criminal operations crossing multiple jurisdictions." Eleanor examines the map with professional interest, noting strategic positions and potential challenges within her assigned region. "Organized claim jumping and payroll robberies, according to the governor's briefing." "Exactly so," Parker confirms. "Operations suggesting military experience and tactical planning beyond typical outlaw capabilities. Possibly former soldiers who've turned their training toward criminal enterprise." "Similar to Blackwell's operation," Eleanor notes, making immediate connections to the conspiracy she helped dismantle. The lieutenant nods. "The governor specifically mentioned your experience with such threats as qualification for this assignment. Your understanding of both military tactics and criminal methodology provides a unique perspective." The train gathers speed, Santa Fe's outskirts giving way to the expansive western landscape, mesas, arroyos, and distant mountains, creating the challenging terrain that has sheltered lawlessness since territorial establishment. Eleanor considers this new chapter opening before her with a clear-eyed assessment of both its challenges and opportunities. "The Rangers are still establishing operational protocols," Parker continues. "As one of the first appointments, you'll help define procedures for future recruits. Building something that will outlast us," Eleanor observes, appropriate continuity from Thomas's work. The lieutenant's expression reveals respectful curiosity, though he maintains professional restraint from inquiring further about her personal history. Instead, he returns to operational matters, detailing the resources available at Ranger headquarters and the specialized equipment being assembled for field operations. As Parker outlines these practical considerations, Eleanor's attention divides between his briefing and the passing landscape visible through her window. This Western territory, its vast spaces and untamed character, had initially represented escape and anonymity after Thomas's death. Now it offers something different, legitimate purpose for the skills she'd once employed in war, channeled toward establishing justice rather than merely surviving conflict. "One last thing, Miss Winters," Parker concludes, retrieving an official document from his uniform pocket. "Governor Fremont asked me to deliver your final commission papers personally." Eleanor accepts the document, noting the territorial seal and official signatures establishing her authority. Unlike her wartime role, unacknowledged, unofficial, operating in shadows, this position carries public recognition and legal standing. The Rangers represent something new for the territory, Parker observes. Not quite military, not traditional lawmen either. We're creating procedures adapted to unique Western challenges rather than imposing Eastern models. Breaking from established conventions, Eleanor notes with ironic appreciation. Seems I've found the appropriate company, Lieutenant. Their conversation continues as the train heads westward, discussing operational specifics and regional challenges awaiting her attention. Evening approaches, painting the desert landscape in gold and crimson as they cross the territorial boundary into Arizona. As darkness falls, Eleanor excuses herself from tactical discussions to spend a moment alone with her thoughts. Standing in the narrow corridor outside her compartment, she watches stars emerge above the silhouetted mountains, the same stars that had witnessed her transformation from celebrated wartime operative to grieving widow to this newest incarnation. From her pocket, she retrieves Thomas's pocket watch, its familiar weight a connection to everything that brought her to this moment. Opening the case, she finds the small photograph concealed within, Thomas in his uniform, beside Eleanor in her wedding dress, both looking younger and unburdened by the conspiracy that would eventually claim his life. Different path, same purpose, she whispers to the image, acknowledging both continuity and transformation in her journey. Lieutenant Parker approaches respectfully, hesitant to intrude on her private moment. Forgive the interruption, Miss Winters. We'll be stopping briefly. At the next station, there's someone waiting to meet you. Eleanor's expression reveals curiosity as she returns the watch to her pocket. I wasn't expecting a reception until Prescott. The train begins slowing as they approach a small station outpost, barely more than a water stop for the locomotive. As they disembark onto the lamp-lit platform, Eleanor immediately identifies a familiar figure waiting beside a freight wagon, Samuel Washington, his dignified bearing unmistakable even in the dim evening light. Samuel, she greets him with genuine warmth. This is unexpected. Thought you might appreciate proper equipment for your new position, he explains, gesturing toward the wagon. There, nestled securely in fresh straw, lies a custom saddle bearing her distinctive oak leaf design, accompanied by saddlebags and equipment clearly crafted for serious field operations. More significantly, a blue-tick hound raises his head from the wagon bed, ears perking forward with immediate recognition. Scout leaps down with surprising agility for his age, pressing against Eleanor's legs with enthusiastic reunion. The Anderson children were heartbroken, Samuel admits with a smile. But I explained Scout has important work to do with you. Besides, you'll need a proper partner for tracking operations. Eleanor kneels, greeting her canine companion with an uncharacteristic, emotional display. Hello, old friend, she murmurs as Scout licks her face enthusiastically. Ready for a new adventure? The conductor calls the all-aboard signal, leaving just moments for this unexpected reunion. Eleanor grasps Samuel's hand with genuine gratitude. Thank you for understanding what I needed before I realized it myself. You were never meant for quiet retirement, Miss Eleanor, he responds with perceptive wisdom. Some people are built for a larger purpose. As the train prepares to depart, Eleanor and Scout board together, the hound immediately assuming his accustomed position at her side. Lieutenant Parker observes this reunion with appreciative understanding, recognizing another piece falling into place for the Ranger team under construction. Proper tracking dog, he notes approvingly as they return to their compartment. Trained, I presume. Military service during the war, Eleanor confirms, scratching Scout's ears affectionately. He understands commands in 3 languages and can follow trails most men would never detect. The train resumes its westward journey, carrying Eleanor Winters toward her new beginning. Through the window, she watches the last glow of sunset fade beyond distant mountains. Not an ending, but a transition. one horizon yielding to another as the landscape continues unfolding with possibilities. In her mind, Eleanor reviews the extraordinary path that has led to this moment, from legendary sharpshooter to grieving widow to something entirely new. The quiet shopkeeper who crafted leather goods in Copper Springs has completed her purpose. Justice finally secured for Thomas and countless others victimized by Wilson's conspiracy. Now Eagle Eye rides toward fresh challenges, her skills and determination dedicated to establishing justice across a territory where law remains as fluid as the desert sands. The woman who Outlaws once mocked as a helpless widow has reclaimed her full identity, not merely returning to her former self, but evolving into something more complete than either previous incarnation. Scout settles at her feet with contented sigh, his presence representing perfect continuity between past and future. Eleanor rests her hand on his head, allowing herself a rare moment of perfect certainty. "Forward," she whispers, the word both acknowledgement and commitment as the train carries her into darkness that will eventually yield to new dawn. The Arizona night embraces the westbound train, stars illuminating its passage toward Prescott, where new beginnings await the territory's deadliest sharpshooter. No longer hidden in widow's weeds, but stepping fully into her remarkable capabilities, ready to write the next chapter of an extraordinary American life. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.